Chapter 490. Chen Xingxue was a famous general of the Yin border army. Before leading the army, he had been one of the most outstanding disciples of Celestial Seal sect. He had reached Realm 7 long before he became a general of the border army. From a certain point of view, other than the master of Celestial Seal sect, if the remaining elders of Celestial Seal sect fought with Chen Xingxue, the one to survive would be Chen Xingxue. This was likely the most important reason why these people had asked Chen Xingxue to come back and kill Zhang Yi. They needed to be absolutely safe. Looking down from this grass hut, the master of Celestial Seal sect saw the gates to Celestial Seal sect close. With the gates closed, no one could enter Celestial Seal sect. Then who could stop Chen Xingxue from killing Zhang Yi? When this wise old man felt a chill run down his spine, a middle-aged man covered in dust was slowly walking along the mountain path towards a Taoist temple. When this middle-aged man dressed in cloth robes walked slowly, Zhang Yi and a dozen Celestial Seal sect disciples were cultivating, or rather, exploring in this Taoist hall. This Taoist temple looked very ordinary on the outside, made of ordinary wood and bricks. However, on every wooden pillar and wall inside, there was a layer of flowing light that seemed to be changing but was almost eternal. This layer of flowing light seemed to imprison everything in the Taoist temple, allowing it to be preserved without any change. There were patterns carved everywhere in the temple. These patterns that did not have fixed rules and form patterns could be seal scripts or not. Inadvertently, some of the patterns would flash with an imperceptible flame like a bolt of lightning in a thundercloud. This was the Celestial Ascending Hall. Supposedly, one of the highest seals of Celestial Seal sect was hidden among these complicated and unreasonable patterns. Even more importantly, in the history of Celestial Seal sect, of the 7 people who comprehended the Celestial Ascending Taoist seal in the Celestial Ascending Hall, each person had looked at the patterns in different positions. Some people comprehended talisman intent from the complicated patterns on the beam, some from the window lattice, some from the brick wall, and some even through the mottled light from the window. However, despite all these, the concept and power of the sky-ascending Taoist talisman were the same. So in the records of Celestial Seal sect, everything inside the Celestial Ascending Hall described the same seal essence, the same principle. There were many paths leading to this truth, but the final destination was the same. The 7 people who had comprehended the Celestial Ascending Taoist seal all became the masters of Celestial Seal sect. So this Celestial Ascending Hall was not just important. It was a great honor to be able to enter this hall to study. Only the best students of Celestial Seal sect were allowed to enter here to cultivate. From a certain perspective, being able to enter this place meant that one had the possibility of becoming the next Supreme Headmaster. Beautiful hope could make people excited and happy. This was especially true for those who were easily satisfied. Zhang Yi was someone who was easily satisfied. He was very satisfied to be able to obtain some friendly friendships and not be mocked or isolated by others. As to becoming the master of Celestial Seal sect, he had never thought about it. At this time, he tried to stare at the patterns of varying depths on the ceiling. He felt that they were beautiful, and the patterns at the top were the part of the hall that attracted him the most. He did not like the patterns that seemed to be damp in the darkness. But no matter how serious he was, he did not feel anything. He did not feel that these patterns were different from ordinary carvings. His eyelids started to feel heavy, and he felt drowsy. Out of the corner of his eyes, he saw that Yi and the others were sometimes frowning, sometimes deep in thought, and sometimes their eyes were shining. Thinking that in such a solemn and meaningful place, he actually felt a little sleepy, he suddenly felt a little ashamed. Suddenly, he felt some coldness in his warm body. This coldness came from outside the hall. He turned around in shock and looked at the half-closed door. No one noticed his movements, not even Yi, who was closest to him. Other than him, no one else felt that inexplicable coldness. The door to the hall had yet to open, but the sound of footsteps rang clearly in his ears like a drum. These footsteps were extremely even and powerful, with a rhythm and presence that could not be changed by anything else. His first impression was that this person's feet had always been fixed in such a way. Even if it was a mountain or a river, He would always walk with such a fixed pace. The door to the hall opened. A thread of cool mountain wind flooded into the hall. However, in Zhang Yi's perception, the silent space suddenly buzzed. The air was cut open by the sharp sword and saber. The wind was strong, and his nose was filled with the smell of rust and blood. A middle-aged man appeared in his sight. This middle-aged man was only dressed in ordinary cloth clothes, but the aura he sensed, including this middle-aged man's mountain-like cold aura, or perhaps it could be said that it came from within his body, from his valiant heart, made him immediately understand that this was a commander, moreover an extremely formidable commander who had experienced countless battles. Only now did the other Celestial Seal sect disciples in the Celestial Ascending Hall discover this person's arrival and turnaround. The middle-aged man was naturally Chen Xingxue. His appearance was not outstanding. His skin was slightly dark, and there was a sword wound on his left cheek. His eyes appeared too small. Yet because of his unique presence, no one in the hall felt he was ugly. "You are Zhang Yi?" His gaze immediately landed on Zhang Yi and did not move away. Then he said with some emotion, as expected, "You are the most outstanding of this generation of Celestial Seal sect disciples. You were the first to sense my arrival." Zhang Yi was slightly shocked, but he was a true gentleman, so he immediately bowed and asked, "This junior is Zhang Yi. Elder is?" Chen Xingxue. The silent hall was in an uproar. Zhang Yi stilled. He did not know why the surroundings had such a reaction. Because he had never heard the name of this person in front of him, he immediately felt ashamed of his ignorance. Chen Xingxue is a cultivator from Celestial Seal sect and the general of the Tiger Cage army at the border of the Yin dynasty. A soft female voice reached Zhang Yi's ears. He recognized it to be Murong Xiaoyi's voice. Zhang Yi turned slightly to thank Murong Xiaoyi, who was not far behind him. At the same time, he was even more puzzled and shocked. The Qin dynasty rewarded people based on military merit. As a Qin person, he naturally knew the status of a true general. I was able to sense general's arrival first because I am a Qin person and am more sensitive to sword and blade essence than them. It is not because my perception is better than theirs, or rather, I am not focused here. However, he still explained, that's why the general is overpraising me. Humility and fearlessness are often the qualities cultivators need the most in order to become stronger. You have both. Chen Xingxue shook his head. You do not have to be humble. I cultivated in Celestial Seal sect for 13 years and led troops at the border for 12 years. I have seen many people and have my own judgment of people. Zhang Yi was not good at arguing with people, much less for himself. So when he heard these words, he bowed his head slightly and did not know what to say. Chen Xingxue looked calmly at this youth he admired and said with some regret, "But I came this time to kill you." What? When he said this, the entire hall was filled with gasps. Zhang Yi was stunned. Do not ask why. Chen Xingxue's cold gaze swept across everyone behind Zhang Yi, including Murong Xiaoyi, who was preparing to speak. I am here, and Celestial Seal sect has closed its gates. No one has come to stop me. You should know what has happened. So those who are not related, please leave. His voice contained the sound of a sword. This voice caused everyone to feel cold, and their breathing to become heavy. Yu Yi's breathing stopped, his palms covered in cold sweat. Murong Xiaoyi narrowed her eyes and looked toward Zhang Yi. She saw Zhang Yi was about to speak. At the same time, she thought that based on Chen Xingxue's attitude toward Zhang Yi, he would give Zhang Yi a chance to ask questions. I do not know who sent you to kill me. But here, I fear you will destroy the Celestial Ascending Hall. However, what made her almost speechless was that Zhang Yi said such a sentence at this moment. Even now, Zhang Yi's first concern was destroying the Celestial Ascending Hall. Chapter 491. But these words caused Chen Xingxue to stare at him for a long time. I cannot destroy the Celestial Ascending Hall. Then he looked seriously at Zhang Yi and said, Unless you are stronger than me, you cannot destroy the Celestial Ascending Hall. Zhang Yi looked at the flowing light in the Celestial Ascending Hall and knew his worries were unnecessary. He thought and looked at this powerful elder of Celestial Seal sect. He asked. Since you are a general of the Yen border army, you must be a righteous person to be able to lead troops in such a difficult place for decades. Also, you are a disciple of Celestial Seal sect. The sect master cannot have you come to kill me. Then have you considered that you are going against the sect by doing this? Chun Xingchui nodded and answered seriously. Some of the sect master's decisions may be wrong. What you said makes sense, but it doesn't make sense at all. Zhang Yi said. The existence of any sect is due to the rules they need to follow. The sect master is not just an empty title. If you feel the sect master's decision is wrong, then the first person you need to oppose is the sect master. Or rather, you can kill the sect master, and a new sect master will have you kill me. If even the sect master is an empty title, then the sect will have no spirit and cannot exist for a long time. Hearing Zhang Yi speak of such principles to Chun Xingchui, the other Celestial Seal sect disciples in the hall were speechless. They thought someone of Chun Xingchui's status had come from afar, and the gates of Celestial Seal sect were closed. How could something like this change because of Zhang Yi's words? Yet to everyone's surprise, Chun Xingchui said after a moment of silence, "You are right." But Chun Xingchui's next words were even more shocking. He raised his head, looked at Zhang Yi, and said seriously, "So after killing you, we will think of a way to change our sect master." Zhang Yi stilled. Facing such domineering words, he was speechless. Chun Xingchui did not speak again. He just looked calmly at the people behind Zhang Yi. The meaning in his eyes was very simple. You can stay, but if you do, you will die here with Zhang Yi. Lu Yi's body trembled slightly. He gritted his teeth and didn't move. Other than him, all the other Celestial Seal sect disciples, including Murong Xiaoi, started to walk with their heads bowed. Since Celestial Seal sect's gates were closed and Chun Xingchui appeared here to kill Zhang Yi, this meant that the battle between the highest level of Celestial Seal sect was over. Today, Celestial Seal sect was to kill Zhang Yi. Moreover, they knew very well that even if all of them worked together, they would not be a match for Chun Xingchui. Youth and hot-bloodedness were too fragile in the face of an obvious result. Looking at his classmates leaving, Zhang Yi did not have any sorrow in his eyes. He could not help but turn to Lu Yi and shake his head. He said, "You should leave too. We are not a match for him." Lu Yi looked at him and asked, "Then when he wants to kill you, will you fight back?" Zhang Yi stilled and said, "Of course I will not stand and let him kill me. I will fight back." Lu Yi said, "Since you're not going to commit suicide and you want to fight, I'll naturally help you fight." Zhang Yi was slightly helpless. He felt that Lu Yi's words were forcing him to commit suicide. "You are the heir to the Yellow Heaven Daoist seal of Celestial Seal sect, so I will spare your life." Chun Xingchui looked at Lu Yi and said naturally. At this time, a seal essence suddenly appeared in the Celestial Ascending Hall. This seal essence was filled with murderousness. It did not come from Chun Xingchui, but from behind him. Behind him was Murong Xiaoi, who was walking out with her head bowed in shame. Murong Xiaoi was still walking out with her head bowed, but this seal essence came from her. A white flowing light, like a ray of moonlight in the night sky, gently and at unimaginable speed fell towards Chun Xingchui's back. There was a deafening boom. Zhang Yi and Lu Yi looked dazedly at the dust in front of them. After the dust, the other Celestial Seal sect disciples retreated in panic out of the hall. Murong Xiaoi's body flew out and hit the wall above the door. With a muffled grunt, she forcefully twisted her body and landed, a thread of blood coming out of the corner of her mouth. Chun Xingchui did not turn around. He said faintly, as expected of someone from the Murong clan, "You're brave and smart. But when I first arrived at the borders, I had to face at least dozens of assassination attempts every year. Compared to those assassins, whether it's your timing or your level of cultivation, you're too weak." Zhang Yi's eyes widened. He looked at Murong Xiaoi, who was silently looking at Chun Xingchui's back with hidden anger. Only now did he realize that Murong Xiaoi was staying for him. Zhang Yi's gaze caused Murong Xiaoi to become furious. She gritted her teeth and said, "What? You think I am afraid of death like those peoples?" Zhang Yi said with difficulty, "But you will die like this." Murong Xiaoi sneered. "Who am I? Just him and his sect uncles dare to kill me?" The Murong family's status in the Yin dynasty was higher than the marquisate establishments in Chongling. So her words were reasonable, and she was very confident. Starting from today, your status may be different. Yet Chun Xingxue turned slightly to glance at her and said, I will try to hold back, but that does not mean I do not dare to kill you. Murong Xiaoyi's face suddenly paled. Zhang Yi and Yu sucked in a breath of cold air and couldn't help looking at each other. Some matters only represent a certain opinion and one's position in the future. After Chun Xingxue said this, another seal essence appeared in the celestial ascending hall. This time, the seal essence came from him. Almost instinctively, Zhang Yi swung the stone sword in his hand forward. The dust that had just landed on the ground floated up with his sword essence. Each speck of dust was like a boulder in water, showing an unwavering presence. Boom! Yet in the next moment he felt great pain in his wrist. Cracking sounds came from his chest as several of his ribs were broken. Chun Xingxue looked indifferently and emotionlessly at Zhang Yi, whose eyes were filled with disbelief. His left hand was held vertically in front of him. The seal essence came from the palm lines in his palm. Each line seemed to become a seal script that contained terrifying power and cultivation. Following his thoughts, several streaks of white light appeared in the air, like several whips that continued to dance in front of him. As his power advanced, Zhang Yi's broken ribs were about to pierce through Zhang Yi's heart and lungs. But at this time, the first accident occurred. Zhang Yi spat out a mouthful of blood. He took a step back. Talisman intent rose from the ground beneath his feet. In his perception, pieces of bricks floated up and blocked the white light, blocking the forward power for a moment. With Zhang Yi's cultivation, it was a miracle that he could avoid being killed in one breath. It was also at this moment that a strange emotion flashed through his mind for the second time. Without any warning, a huge force broke through the protective yuan qi behind him and pierced his back. Chun Xingxue turned around. Before he turned around, a fiery red Dao talisman flew out of his right palm. With a boom, a pill cauldron formed from true fire appeared behind him. Yet the center of the cauldron still flashed with a cold light. This cold light fell on his body as he twisted and landed on the left side of his waist. A bloody mist suddenly appeared on the left side of his waist. The cold light penetrated his flesh and left behind a clear wound. Fish intestine. Chun Xingxue's expression shook. He frowned but did not panic. He said in a cold voice, "This item of the Murong family is in your hands as expected." Lu Yi's face was pale. In the previous moment, he thought that Zhang Yi had died. But Zhang Yi had survived, and Murong Xiaoyi's cold light was clearly a sword essence. Murong Xiaoyi was not Zhang Yi. She was skilled in the seal path and not the sword path. How could she wound Chun Xingxue with one blow? He was shocked, but he knew if he was not fast enough, he could not change Zhang Yi's fate of being killed in the next moment. With a muffled grunt, he spat out a mouthful of blood. The vital energy in his body surged out without regard to whether his meridians could withstand it. A yellow seal flew out of his hand and carried his body in front of Zhang Yi. The roof of Celestial Ascending Hall was covered in yellow clouds. A vast aura descended like the vault of the heavens. Lu Yi's finger flicked towards Chun Xingxue like it was moving the sky. Chun Xingxue's eyes narrowed slightly. He was not in a hurry. His left hand pressed against his wound, and threads of vital energy sewed the wound together. At the same time, a sharp seal essence cut towards the many invisible threads in the air. The yellow Heaven Dao seal was one of the two strongest seals of Celestial Seal Sect, and the hardest to defeat. Yet the enormous difference in cultivation and power gave him enough confidence to use an ordinary seal essence to defeat it. However, at this moment Li Yi, Zhang Yi, and even Zhang Yi felt something strange. They could not help but raise their heads and look up. Chapter 492. Any color, tangible or intangible seal essence, or sword energy, was the refraction of vital energy or primal energies of the universe when they gathered and dispersed. The yellow cloud formed by Lu Yi's yellow heaven seal essence was the same. However, At this moment, his talisman essence was clearly pressing down with an incomparably resolute aura. But the yellow cloud did not sink down. Instead, it rose up, attracted by the roof of the celestial ascending hall. Like a thick carpet, it stuck to the roof of the celestial ascending hall. What was even more shocking was that some of the mysterious lines on the ceiling of the celestial ascension palace faded away, but some of them lit up instead. These lit-up lines overlapped with the lines in the yellow cloud, as if a key was perfectly aligned with the keyhole, perfectly fitting together. Because of the fitting of these lights, Zhang Yi and the others could see clearly that there were clear lines in the yellow cloud. These lines were the main channels through which the primal energies of the universe gathered by this seal essence flowed. The yellow cloud did not press down, but a new power pressed down according to Lu Yi's thoughts. The sharp seal essence in front of Chun Xingxue cut at the invisible threads around Lu Yi. But with a crack, a real blade seemed to break in the air. His seal essence did not cut through the threads as he had imagined. A powerful recoil caused him to taste blood at the tip of his tongue. Lu Yi was shocked. He felt he was stronger than ever. But this strength did not come from himself, but from the celestial ascending hall. Chun Xingxue took a step back. With just one step, he left behind an afterimage in front of him. Then this afterimage exploded. In the visible waves of energy, the floating dust swayed, but still stubbornly wanted to stay where they were, and slowly formed the shadows of stone steps. The cold light that had wounded Chun Xingxue showed its true appearance behind these stone steps, and in front of Zhang Yi. This was a sword smaller than a dagger. The blade of the sword was white, and it wasn't straight. Instead, it had a twisted arc to it. This twist was very natural, more natural than any curve made by a master in the world, like a fish intestine. It really is the Yuchang sword. Chun Xingxue looked at this extremely small sword, his pupils constricting as he muttered to himself. Then, he looked at the illusory stone steps in front of him and the yellow clouds that were sucked to the roof of the palace. He couldn't help but shake his head and say, "Interesting." Just now, he was unable to use his cultivation and absolute strength to break Lu Yi's yellow heaven Taoist talisman by force. This was because the celestial talisman of the celestial ascending hall resonated with the celestial ascending talisman, and the two talismans merged into one. This was like celestial ascending hall sensing the danger of the direct disciple of celestial seal sect who grasped the yellow heaven Taoist seal and naturally sent out a protective power. However, the reason why he couldn't kill Zhang Yi with one strike was because of the talisman intent that Zhang Yi had used with his sword. This was the true mountain immortal talisman. It did not belong to the yellow heaven Taoist seal and the celestial ascending Taoist seal. But in the legends, celestial seal sect disciples who could comprehend this seal essence were fated to be the guardians of celestial seal sect. Min Mountain Sword sect's sword essence was the coldest and sharpest, but celestial seal sect's true mountain celestial seal sect was gentle and tough, a true foundation. This was a combination of offense and defense. He could understand why Zheng Xiu wanted Zhang Yi to die. But if he did not die here, Zhang Yi was not the only youth who was fated to have an astounding future. Lu Yi was the same. At the moment of true life and death, the yellow heaven Taoist seal and the seal essence of celestial ascending hall merged into one and resonated. Lu Yi would definitely be able to comprehend some of the seal essence of the celestial ascending Taoist seal. In the future, he might even comprehend the seal essence. This was two of celestial seal sect's greatest skills gathered in his hands. Just facing these two juniors seemed to be the limit, but there was also the Yuchang sword. The Yuchang sword had been made for the king of ancient Yiye by the publicly recognized best swordsmith in the world. It had taken the tin of Qijin Mountain, the copper of Rui Creek, and tempered with heavenly lightning to create this astounding sword. In the legends, when this sword was first formed, it seemed to be sentient. Back then, when the great swordsman Xue Zhu saw this sword, he said that the Yuchang sword defies reason and cannot be subdued. A subject kills the monarch, a son kills his father. The meaning was that the sword essence of this sword was rebellious to start with, and used to kill the monarch and kill the father. Of course, This may have been a legend after this sword really killed the king of Wu and caused the destruction of a dynasty. But when he encountered this sword, the sword essence of this sword was like there was a heaven-defying swordsman continuously attacking. However, even two young people like Zhang Yi and Yu Yi, in addition to the Yuchang sword, could only make him feel interested. Since you can control the Yuchang sword, why did you not act when Lu Yi represented Yellow Heaven Daoist sect to challenge Celestial Seal sect? Swallowing the blood in his throat, he slowly turned to the side and asked seriously as he looked at the dark and wary Murong Xiaoyi. Murong Xiaoyi frowned. Such a question meant that even though the other was at the border, he knew everything that had happened in Celestial Seal sect. The Yuchang sword does not belong to Celestial Seal sect. Even if you can win with it, it is an unfair victory. She looked at this wounded but unaffected general and said slowly, also, it is too vicious to use a sword like this against a youth. Pity. Chun Xingchui smiled self-deprecatingly and then said, pity that even so, you cannot win against me. No one felt that his words were arrogant. Lu Yi's back was soaked in cold sweat. Zhang Yi started to cough and cough blood. While he had managed to survive the attack of a cultivator 2 realms above him, his bones were broken, and his heart and lungs were injured. Yet at this time, he was thinking, if his little sect brother Ding Ning was here, what would Ding Ning do? He knew that the Yuchang sword and Happy's Yellow Heaven Daoist seal could only stop one of Chun Xingchui's attacks. Then when Chun Xingchui attacked again, he would die. That was just a time of 2 breaths. The master of Celestial Seal sect was still standing by the window. He looked down at the heaven-ascending Dao palace from above, a strange luster suddenly appearing in his dim eyes. Sensing the change in his emotions, the black-robed old man who had been at ease all this time was moved slightly. He said with slight disdain, "Do you feel there is hope? You may have forgotten something." The master of Celestial Seal sect said coolly, "It was not my intention to have Zhang Yi come to the capital. It was also not Zheng Xiu's intention to enter Celestial Seal sect." The black-robed old man's expression changed slightly. Yet he immediately said coldly, "Since Chun Xingchui has entered Celestial Ascension Hall, killing Zhang Yi is just a matter of thought. But right now, Zhang Yi is still alive." The master of Celestial Seal sect interrupted him. "Also, other than the person who tried to get Zhang Yi to come to Celestial Seal sect, there is another person you did not expect." The black-robed old man's breathing paused slightly, and he had a bad feeling. He stepped to the window and looked around. His eyes were filled with indescribable disbelief. Chapter 493. Celestial Seal sect was unusually quiet at this time. Even the Celestial Seal sect disciples who knew Chun Xingchui's intentions left Celestial Ascending Hall far away. Celestial Seal sect was recognized as the top sect of the Yan dynasty. Just like how the thunder in the sky could spread through the earth, what happened in Celestial Seal sect could reflect the changes in the entire dynasty. These Celestial Seal sect disciples did not dare to be involved in such a change, especially when their families had not been able to send in any information beforehand. This meant that the change in Celestial Seal sect this time was not something they could interfere with. Yet at this time, in the sight of the black-robed old man, a Celestial Seal sect disciple came to Celestial Ascending Hall. This Celestial Seal sect disciple had one hand hidden in his sleeve because his hand was crippled. This Celestial Seal sect disciple was naturally Su Qin. Everyone in Celestial Seal sect knew the story of Su Qin and Zhang Yi. In everyone's minds, Su Qin and Zhang Yi were naturally enemies. Therefore, in the black-robed old man's plan, Su Qin was also used in a certain place. Yet now, Su Qin had appeared here. This meant that his plan had gone wrong. The black-robed old man had a bad feeling. His vital energy flowed naturally, and he instinctively raised his right hand. Yet at this time, the master of Celestial Seal sect glanced sideways at him, shook his head, and said in a sincere tone, "Senior sect brother, do not force me to kill you." The black-robed old man's eyes turned cold. But before he could speak, the master of Celestial Seal sect said slowly, "You have used up all your plans, and I am just in the dark and have not done anything. But even so, if your plan fails again, It will be the will of the heavens. The black-robed old man took a deep breath. The coldness in his eyes slowly disappeared. He sighed and did not speak. Inside Celestial Ascending Hall, it was so quiet that even the sound of breathing seemed to disappear. Zhang Yi thought about how his little sect brother, Ding Ning, would deal with this situation and forgot his despair. At this moment of life and death, he thought of a possibility. At this moment, Louis raised his head. His body was trembling uncontrollably. This was his body's natural reaction. This was because he knew that he could die in a single breath. But at this moment, he made the first move. Even if he knew that Zhang Yi wouldn't be able to escape, before Chun Xingxue killed Zhang Yi, he would first burn his last bit of light. That way, Zhang Yi would always have a slight chance. An extremely shrill howl rang out in the silent hall. Lu Yi's 10 fingers were broken. The surging vital energy and primal energies of the universe tore at the yellow clouds floating at the top of the hall with his howl. He turned the seal essence of the yellow heaven Taoist seal into murderousness and swept towards Chun Xingxue, who was standing calmly ahead. At this time, Murong Xiaoi, who had been looking down cautiously, showed determination and viciousness in her eyes. The fish intestine sword floating in front of Zhang Yi was a truly peerless sword. Even the fish intestine sword that had appeared during the Min Mountain Sword trials was just a copy of this sword. The strongest part of this sword was that it had been tempered with the essence of countless copper and tin. The sword itself contained power ordinary cultivators could not imagine. But at this time, the fish intestine sword did not move at all. When the expression in her eyes suddenly changed, an embroidered handkerchief flew out in front of her. The brocade handkerchief was deep red, a red that was as pure as chicken blood. The moment it flew out, it turned invisible and gave off a terrifying seal essence. Lu Yi's heart was naturally filled with a strong sense of shock. This terrifying seal essence was even stronger than the seal essence he was using all his power to display. I had not thought that even the 3,000 red dust of the Murong family is in your hands. It seems the old master of the Murong family dotes on you too much. I wonder what he will think if you do this for an unrelated Qin person. Seal essences were divided into strong and weak. They were the laws that guided the primal energies of the universe, just like how some blades were born sharp and had nothing to do with cultivation. The yellow heaven Daoist seal was the strongest seal essence of the Yin dynasty. Murong Xiaoi's seal essence was even stronger than the yellow heaven Daoist seal. It was hard to imagine, but Chun Xingxue's expression was calm as usual, and he said slowly as though he found it laughable. His own attitude and emotions were not laughable, because he was Chun Xingxue, one of the border generals of the Yin dynasty. The border generals were usually called divine generals. From a certain point of view, they had the ability to not fear the majority of powerful cultivators in the world one-on-one, especially when they had the help of military cultivators. They could even defeat almost all cultivators in the world. As he spoke calmly, his left hand seemed to pick up a flower and used a seal essence. Just like a legendary saint picking up a mysterious flower, several strands of pink lines appeared in the air. There was an explosion. Lu Yi and Murong Xiaoi's eyes were filled with disbelief. Their talisman intents collided. Pew! The two of them opened their mouths at the same time, but they couldn't say anything. Then, they spat out a mouthful of blood at the same time and flew backwards. Chun Xingxue stood calmly, still in his posture of picking up the flower, unharmed. Both Lu Yi and Murong Xiaoi were certain that Chun Xingxue was just using a simple seal essence. However, this simple talisman essence forcibly changed the direction of their talisman essences. This was cultivation. He was far beyond the two of them in the Great Realm. Yu Yi and Murong Xiaoi flew backwards. Other than despair, their eyes were also filled with incomprehension, especially Murong Xiaoi. She was furious. This incomprehension and anger was not because of Chun Xingxue's strength, but because she and Lu Yi were going all out, especially her. She even used an ancient seal that even Celestial Seal sect did not have. This ancient seal was the ultimate treasure of her family. Originally, It was just for her to comprehend seal essences. Now, she activated the seal essence on it for Zhang Yi, but it did not have the effect she hoped for. More importantly, Zhang Yi did not attack. When Lui was going all out against her, Zhang Yi seemed unmoved. Unmoved? Was he just waiting for death? Zhang Yi had been unmoved all this time. Even the expression on his face seemed to be very stiff. He looked like he was waiting for death. However, right at that moment he moved. The stone sword he had been holding tightly in his hand, tighter than at any other time, stabbed upwards. A white goat horn-like sword energy with a unique seal essence made people feel like there was a goat climbing up the stone steps and trying its best to raise its horn. For the first time, shock appeared in Chun Xingque's calm eyes. In this moment, he could not react. This was because Zhang Yi's sword was not aimed at him, but at the top of the palace. Zhang Yi was very nervous, and his eyes showed an unprecedented frenzy, because he had always been rational, and he had always followed the rules. This was the first time he had gambled in his life, because this matter was not only related to his own life and death. Therefore, this strike of his was the most powerful strike of his life. Chapter 494. Chun Xingque's shock and bewilderment only lasted for a short moment. Then he shook his head and said, "Boring." One did not know how boring one's life was. Zhang Yi's sword essence went towards the roof of the Celestial Ascending Hall, and not him, because he wanted to provoke a stronger backlash from the seal essence in the Celestial Ascending Hall. Yet the seal of the Celestial Ascending Hall came from the Grand Master, who founded Celestial Seal Sect. His cultivation was much higher than his. How could Zhang Yi affect it with his cultivation? Crack! The horn-like sword light stabbed at the roof of the hall. The cracking sound came from Zhang Yi's wrist. A majestic and terrifying recoil went against the sword intent and rushed to his sword-wielding wrist, causing the clear sound of bones cracking to ring out from his wrist. Great pain charged into his mind. He endured the great pain and did not let go. His left hand landed on the sword hilt, and he channeled the remaining power in his body into the sword hilt. The white goat hanging horn emphasized the stalemate. What he fought for was this moment of stalemate. Just like how he was borrowing the power of the Celestial Ascending Taoist seal, he also had a power he could borrow, the sword in his hand. Chun Xingque did not realize at this time that the small stone sword in his hand was Shui Wangshu's life-bond sword. Zhang Yi's left hand landed on the sword hilt. His left hand, and even the bones in his arms and chest gave off ear-piercing cracking sounds again. He spat out a mouthful of blood, but the sword essence did not retreat. At the front of the sword essence, the tip of the goat horn was still pushing against the powerful seal essence. He managed to achieve this moment of stalemate. The powerful, celestial ascending seal essence pressed down on the small stone sword in his hand. The simple and unadorned small stone sword suddenly lit up like it was burning. Chun Xingque's breathing suddenly stopped. His previous disdain immediately disappeared. The blazing light caused intense pain in his eyes, making it impossible for him to open them. The vital energy gushing out of his fingertips had formed a seal essence. But with a low howl, this seal essence turned to nothing at his fingertips and was turned into flames by the terrifying surge of vital energy. A red lotus bloomed in front of him. Chi! The Yuchang sword that was floating in front of Zhang Yi was the first to fly backwards, slamming into the wall beside him. Then Lu Yi grunted in pain. The invisible seal lines that his hands were pulling whipped his body like willow branches dancing in the wind. His body was constantly twisted by these forces, and in an instant, dozens of bone-deep wounds appeared on his body. Streams of blood flew out from his body like red cloth. The only one who was not affected was Murong Xiaoyi behind Chun Xingque. However, her body began to tremble violently. In her perception, it was as if countless giant blades were stabbing her. Her body did not suffer any damage, but this talisman intent seemed to be able to directly damage her perception, giving her a splitting headache. However, her consciousness was clearer than ever. This was the purifying lotus seal essence. Just like the true mountain seal essence, Celestial Seal Sect was hidden somewhere, But in the legends, it was a terrifying seal essence that could purify everything. Chen Xingxue had comprehended such a seal essence. Zhang Yi's head was also in severe pain. Everything in front of him was white, and there was only a little bit of red. It was as if it was going to turn into a sea of blood, swallowing everything in him. Yet, sensing the temperature and power of the little stone sword in his hand, he gritted his teeth and did not retreat a step. The little stone sword in his hand started to burn. There was a loud bang. A sun seemed to rise in front of him. Blinding and pure light filled every corner of the celestial ascending hall and caused everyone's figures to appear transparent. Chen Xingxue gave a muffled grunt. His blood seemed to be burning. However, what shocked him the most was that there were many green light talismans floating within this dazzling and pure light. These seals were the projections of lines. The lines came from all over the celestial ascending hall. The blinding and pure light was an all-pervasive and powerful sword essence. This kind of sword essence pierced into the depths of every crevice of the celestial ascending hall and forced out the seal essence inside the hall. Zhang Yi's feet gave off sounds of bones cracking. With a bang, Louis fell to the ground. His body was pressed to the ground by the terrifying pressure falling from above, and he could not breathe. Murong Xiaoyi's body was pressed to the door and was about to be charged out. The red lotus in front of Chen Xingxue gave off destructive power, but this power could not spread outwards and was pressed inward. The red at the center of the red lotus grew brighter, like a gem was melting, and the glowing droplets were about to explode from the pressure. All of the celestial ascending hall was shining. The tiles on the hall, the dust flying out of the hall, and even the wormwood growing out of the cracks in the roof were all shining. Celestial Seal Sect was silent, but almost everyone was staring at this place. Seeing such a phenomenon, and sensing the burgeoning presence in the celestial ascending hall, the sect master of Celestial Seal Sect had some emotion in his calm eyes. He knew Chen Xingxue's strength better than anyone else. Even though he just now had a thread of hope, it was just a thread of hope. The performance of the three young people in the hall facing an expert like Chen Xingxue up until now completely surpassed his imagination. Interesting. In the celestial ascending hall, Chen Xingxue felt that Zhang Yi had overestimated himself and spat out the words boring. Su Qin, standing outside the celestial ascending hall, slowly raised his head and said these two words. At this moment, when the swelling power from within the hall was about to burst open the door and rush into his body, his eyes, which had been filled with either self-mockery or ridicule, were instantly filled with an indescribable arrogance and viciousness. His crippled hand reached out. Hundreds of seals floated like ordinary pieces of paper. In the next moment, they followed all kinds of strange paths and landed in various parts of the celestial ascending hall. Boom! The world shook again. The celestial ascending hall was hit by an enormous hammer from the outside. Around the celestial ascending hall, an enormous air ring visible to the naked eye exploded outwards. All the trees within dozens of feet were snapped at the waist, and the broken branches and leaves were thrown outwards. Su Qin vomited blood, his body uncontrollably flying backwards like a piece of rotten wood. In the celestial ascending hall, Zhang Yi gave a muffled grunt and knelt on the ground, unable to support himself. However, his hands were still firmly supporting the sword, and he was still in the stance of attacking. Chen Xingxue's expression changed dramatically. In his rapidly contracting pupils, the green light talismans falling from the ceiling suddenly sped up, like falling snow. The red lotus in front of him disappeared from his perception. Disappearing meant that the connection with him had been severed, and he could not control it. In the next moment, the red lotus shattered. The primal energies of the universe at the center of the red lotus that had been compressed to the limit could not explode outwards and turned into thousands of glowing rays. The glowing rays bloomed outwards. Everyone's bodies were suppressed by the vast and terrifying energy until everything seemed to move in slow motion. Murong Xiaoyi looked in shock as these rays passed through Zhang Yi, Li Yi, and Chen Xingxue's body. She saw the glowing rays pass through their bodies, and warm blood spilled out. Everything was extremely slow, but she did not have time to dodge. She could only raise her body as high as possible, and not let these glowing rays pass through her head and other vital areas. The bright red blood droplets floated in the air like they were still. Zhang Yi, Chen Xingche, Murong Xiaoyi, and even Lu Yi, who was crouching on the ground, were penetrated in many places. In the next moment, as these glowing rays pierced the surrounding walls, the condensed primal energies of the universe exploded violently. All the blood droplets turned to dust with a muffled explosion. Chen Xingchui was the same as Zhang Yi and the others. He was like a piece of cloth that was casually stirred in a dye house, being wantonly kneaded by the rampaging energy. His eyes were filled with disbelief. Outside the celestial ascending hall, Su Qin was hanging from a broken tree, his body pierced by multiple pieces of wood. Everyone was seriously injured and on the verge of death. A middle-aged celestial seal sect man dressed in black robes, his sleeves and collar covered in profound silver lines, shook his head emotionally. He sighed at the result of this battle. At the same time, he sighed at Zheng Xiu's meticulousness. She would always hide a last pawn in any battle that she seemed to have a chance of winning. And he was the backup, the last chess piece that could end everything. As he sighed, he walked out of a pavilion and prepared to walk towards the celestial ascending hall. But at this time, he saw a tall and thin man walk up the stone steps ahead. This man wore the attire of an ordinary celestial seal sect worker, but he had a sword with a long hilt. Chapter 495. Who are you? The middle-aged man in black robes from Celestial Seal sect frowned and instinctively shouted. In his subconscious, this was the base of Celestial Seal sect, and he was a member of Celestial Seal sect. Then this person was naturally a spy who had infiltrated Celestial Seal sect. His voice and presence carried righteousness. Yet facing a shout, the tall and thin man blocking his path slowly gripped the sword hilt in front of him and said calmly, "I am Zhang Yi's sect uncle." Zhang Yi's sect uncle? The middle-aged man stilled, and a scornful smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. He thought, according to seniority, he was Zhang Yi's sect uncle. Then this man dressed in Celestial Seal sect's servant robes was of the same generation as him. Yet in the next moment, when he sensed the sharp sword essence from the other, he suddenly realized, "You come from Chongling?" The tall and thin man looked at him and nodded. He said, "White Goat Cave." The middle-aged man from Celestial Seal sect frowned. His scornful smile disappeared and turned into seriousness. He did not know how this person had come to Celestial Seal sect and appeared at this time. But in his impression, the White Goat Cave that Zhang Yi and the wine shop youth came from was a very weak sect in Chongling. Celestial Seal sect, to Chongling, was like Min Mountain Sword sect and Lingshu Sword Gate. They could not be compared. He did not know that Zhang Yi's only sect uncle from White Goat Cave was Li Daoji. He did not know Li Daoji's name and knew nothing of Li Daoji's story. So he still did not think that this swordsman from White Goat Cave could stop him. This was not an ordinary duel invitation. So when the seriousness appeared on his face, his fingers had silently moved seal essence. Countless yellow leaves that had fallen to the ground floated up, and the veins on each yellow leaf began to glow. The veins of these leaves were natural channels for absorbing nutrients, sunlight, and water vapor from the tree. For a seal master of his level, each yellow leaf was his seal, a weapon given to him by nature. Ever since he entered Celestial Seal sect and had some accomplishments, his lifetime of research was related to the natural veins of these leaves. His name was Cheng Qingye, and seemed to be related to these leaves. He was usually not in Celestial Seal sect, but in the Yin Imperial Palace. Being a talisman master in the Imperial Palace, in a sense, meant that they were extremely powerful. At this time, the yellow leaves that had fallen on the mountain path were lifeless. But with a thought, thin vital energy flowed out of his fingertips and into the meridians of these yellow leaves. These meridians immediately lit up and bloomed with vitality. All the yellow leaves turned green in an instant. The whole mountain path and the air behind him turned green in an instant, as if spring had arrived. His talisman intent was named Spring Intent. The strongest feeling of spring was that it would silently moisten things and arrive quietly. No one knew when it would arrive and where it would arrive. He didn't know when it had arrived, and he didn't know where it had come from, but there was killing intent everywhere. Li Daoji's lips were pressed tightly together. Ever since he left Chongling, he seemed to have completely disappeared from the world. Even Zhang Yi and Su Qin did not know where he had gone. Today, they had not expected him to appear here. Other than his clothing, his appearance and sword did not seem to have changed from Chongling. What was certain was that in Chongling, his cultivation was far from this celestial seal sect cultivators. However, at this moment, when facing such talisman insight, the depths of his eyes that contained piercingly cold, killing intent were completely calm and filled with strong confidence. He unhurriedly pulled out his sword. Then, in a strange manner, as if he was waving a hoe, he waved his sword and chiseled the air in front of him. Countless sizzling sounds could be heard. The seal essence immediately disappeared. The countless green leaves fluttering behind Cheng Qingye turned yellow again. Cheng Qingye retreated dozens of feet in shock. The energy around him shattered the yellow leaves, passed through the pavilion, and hit the mountain wall behind it. This was something he had never encountered before. In his perception, Li Daoji's sword seemed to have made a hole in all of his seals. The primal energies of the universe he had summoned immediately flowed out of that hole. He even sensed that Li Daoji's cultivation was much weaker than his. But this sword caused him to feel terror and powerlessness. At least in this moment, even his confidence was pierced. What sword essence is this? He instinctively screamed. Amidst the screams, a leaf carved from jade flew out of his hand. The inside of this leaf also had countless veins stacked on top of one another. The true essence in his body surged out like a tidal wave, pouring into the leaf carved from jade. This was a Dao seal he had spent many years to forge. It could be said to be his life-bond seal. When this seal appeared, the leaves on the half of the mountain behind him, regardless of whether it was the yellow leaves on the ground or the remaining green leaves on the trees, all left the ground and branches and started to tremble and dance. There was a loud roar in the sky. The primal energies of the universe moved like an enormous mountain. Li Daoji attacked again. He did not change at all. He still gave people the feeling he was swinging a hoe. He swung his sword towards the air in front of him. Cheng Qingye screamed again. The seal essence he had just formed quickly spilled out. The vast amounts of primal energies of the universe flowed through a hole to an unknown place, but left his control. On the jade seal in front of him, only his vital energy was sputtering. It was like countless bolts of lightning were pouring out, but could not be converted into true killing intent. He was in disbelief. He sent out a third seal essence. He instinctively felt that the other might have learned the secrets of the seal path he cultivated, and had created a sword move to defeat his seal. So his third seal was very normal, and was a commonly used seal of Celestial Seal Sect. This was the true Thunder Seal. Even on the battlefield, many powerful cultivators of Celestial Seal Sect had used it, proving it was powerful and unbreakable. Lightning flashed between the lines in his palm. At the same time, someone seemed to cut a hole in the sky with an enormous blade, and a patch of golden light appeared. In his imagination, in the next moment, there would be multiple golden bolts of lightning as thick as water buckets falling down towards Li Daoji. But at this time, Li Daoji attacked again. He gave another blow like a hoe. The seal essence of the true Thunder Seal disappeared. There was the sound of thunder, but no lightning came down. Cheng Qingye paled. His mouth was wide, but he could not make a sound or even breathe. He sent out a fourth seal. This was a sacrificial fire seal. This was the most basic and simple seal essence of Celestial Seal Sect. The most basic and simple usually meant the hardest to defeat. Yet when the heat rose, the seal essence disappeared. Li Daoji still used the same sword to break his Dao seal. With each blow, Li Daoji took a step forward. In just 4 steps, he had passed through the pavilion and was not far away from him. Cheng Qingye felt great terror. He sent out a 5th seal. Multiple indigo flames charged out of the mountain walls on his sides, as though they were going to become a wall. But just as the flames charged out, before the seal essence formed, Li Daoji's sword came down like a hoe. This time, his sword hoe did not use talisman intent, but directly into his chest. The powerful sword energy tore apart his organs and forced the shattered physical energy and flesh out of his mouth. Why is it like this? This was the hardest time to speak. Yet Cheng Qingye was like a drowning person, looking in despair at Li Daoji's sword in his chest, but still managed to make a sound. Chapter 496. Li Daoji had no interest in explaining to a dying enemy. He first had to ensure that Zhang Yi was alive. Therefore, without any hesitation, he drew his sword. The long sword was pulled out of Cheng Qingye's body. The shattered flesh and vitality had an opening. When the tip of the sword finally separated from his flesh, there was a soft pop. Cheng Qingye's entire body was like a deflated balloon, and her last breath disappeared. Cheng Qingye died, killed by a Chongling swordsman of lower cultivation than him. High up in Celestial Seal Sect, the sect master was still standing by the window, watching this scene with great emotion. Why is it like this? The black-robed old man beside him was in a daze. He also let out the same cry of shock as Cheng Qingye before his death. Li Daoji was not interested in answering, but this did not mean that the sect master of Celestial Seal Sect was not interested. First there are seals, then there are weapons, and then there are weapons. The sect master of Celestial Seal Sect slowly turned his head and said seriously to the black-robed old man. This sentence was too simple and difficult for ordinary cultivators to understand. But this black-robed old man was not an ordinary person. So the sect master of Celestial Seal Sect's simple words were like an enormous historical painting that filled his perception. He saw many scenes in an instant. First, there were knots to record things, then charcoal to draw, and then bone to carve. The earliest people with intelligence observed the movement of the sun, moon, and stars, and the changes of the clouds. At the start, they recorded the changes with simple diagrams. In the end, someone comprehended the deeper truths and found that some lines matched the flow of the world. Then seals were created. Seals were carved on jade, metal, and metal. They were used as weapons. The ancient people used weapons to fight against beasts, pray to the world, and attract wind and rain to aid in farming. Later, people prospered and formed countries. They fought and killed each other, and then there were weapons used for killing. The black-robed old man inexplicably broke out in cold sweat. His robes were soaked. He looked at the sect master of Celestial Seal Sect and said in a trembling voice, "You mean my seal path is naturally behind weapons?" The sect master of Celestial Seal Sect looked emotionally at him and said slowly, "Weapons are used for killing, and when combined with people, they are weapons. If this Qin sword is an example, there are seal scripts on the sword. This is the seal path. Adding on the sword manuals and other methods to guide the primal energies of the universe, and the cultivator's vital energy and mental control. This is multiple paths combined. Celestial Seal Sect is like the sun in the sky, and we have seals as our foundation. But now, you should be able to see the power of Zhang Yi and Li Daoji's sword seals combined." After a pause, the sect master of Celestial Seal Sect looked at the black-robed old man who was still sweating and unable to speak. Then he said slowly, "While Zhang Yi cultivates the highest seal essence of Celestial Seal Sect, Li Daoji does not have the seal essence of Celestial Seal Sect. Celestial Seal Sect is not the only sect in the world that has the strongest seal path. So I always thought that if Celestial Seal Sect wants to survive, it can only rely on people, and not the seals left behind by the elders." The black-robed old man started to tremble. He looked at the sect master of Celestial Seal Sect and could not help but ask, "You say that Li Daoji's seal and weapon are combined, and he does not use the seals of Celestial Seal Sect. Then what seal does he use? You know that in the early years you secretly sent messengers to Celestial Seal Sect, and then Celestial Seal Sect grew. But you do not know that when I traveled and wanted to see Chongling, just as I arrived outside Chongling, I saw a patch of black night." The sect master of Celestial Seal Sect said coolly, I encountered the legendary leader of the old nobility. It was noon, but I saw a patch of black night from him. That was a seal essence he deliberately showed me. Then I knew that among the old nobility of Chongling, there were people like Celestial Seal Sect who knew powerful seals. Before meeting him, I was as stubborn as you, and could even be said to be stubborn. But after seeing him, I knew that the future of Celestial Seal Sect would depend on the change of our thoughts. You were too biased towards Zheng Xiu, so I did not let you know that the prosperity of Celestial Seal Sect did not come from Zheng Xiu's help, but also from the leader of the old nobility. Have you ever thought that we are Yin people? How can I completely submit to that woman from Jiaodong Commandery of the Qin dynasty because of the temporary prosperity of the sect? The sect master of Celestial Seal Sect looked at the black-robed old man who was struggling to breathe and said sincerely, "Senior sect brother, you should know that everything comes from the balance of the situation. Zhang Yi came to Celestial Seal Sect, not just because I knew he was the disciple I needed, but also because of the arrangements of the leader of the old nobility. Starting from when I met that person, Celestial Seal Sect had never completely submitted to Zheng Xiu's will." The black-robed old man struggled to breathe and groaned in pain. A dozen breaths ago, he stood at the top of Celestial Seal Sect and thought he could see very far. But now, he knew that he saw many things too close to home. It is useless. He suddenly looked up in pain at the sect master of Celestial Seal Sect and shook his head. The sect master of Celestial Seal Sect stilled. He did not understand the meaning of the words. What happens here in Celestial Seal Sect cannot change the entire result of the Yin dynasty. The black-robed old man struggled to breathe and said, "Oh." The sect master of Celestial Seal Sect laughed. He shook his head and said, "The night before last, I dreamed of a mountain." The black-robed old man looked in puzzlement at him, sweat dripping down like rain. "That mountain is a very small black mountain from Qi." The sect master of Celestial Seal Sect looked at him and said, "I originally thought it was a dream, but when I woke up, I felt true coldness. The coldness came from Yin energy." The black-robed old man finally reacted, his eyes filled with great shock and disbelief. "The teacher of the Qi Emperor, Yining?" The sect master of Celestial Seal Sect laughed emotionally. His gaze left Celestial Seal Sect and looked towards the Yin Imperial Palace in the distance. The trees there had already begun to move. However, in his mind, the scene of old trees withering and new trees growing appeared. Li Daoji held his sword and walked in front of Celestial Ascension Hall. No one stopped him. In his path, there was only Su Qin, who had fallen to the side. Su Qin looked at this sect uncle of White Goat Cave and smiled eerily and bleakly. More blood flowed from the corner of his lips. Li Daoji frowned slightly and gripped his sword slightly harder. But in the next moment, he gave up killing intent and did not attack to kill Su Qin. Then he pushed open the door and walked into Celestial Ascension Hall. There was blood everywhere in Celestial Ascension Hall, for seriously injured people lay in pools of blood. But before the end, while these four were dying, none of them had fainted. Seeing Li Daoji push open the door and enter, Zhang Yi's eyes widened in shock. He suspected he had seen wrong, that he was hallucinating before his death. Li Daoji nodded slightly at him and then passed through the pool of blood to walk in front of Chen Xingchui. Chen Xingchui sighed softly and closed his eyes. Li Daoji attacked without hesitation. The tip of the sword quickly and lightly entered his heart. Chen Xingchui died painlessly. When Li Daoji came in front of Zhang Yi and bent down to apply medicine, Zhang Yi bit the tip of his tongue. "Do not be so stupid. You are not delirious yet." Seeing his actions, Li Daoji said, "Sect uncle?" Zhang Yi finally started to understand that what he saw was not a hallucination before his death. He could not help but grow excited but still said, "Sect uncle, please save them first." Li Daoji smiled indescribably. This stupid White Goat Cave disciple was still a gentleman and had not changed. Thinking of a certain piece of news he had just heard, the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth quickly dimmed. How did that White Goat Cave disciple, who was countless times smarter than Zhang Yi, die? Chapter 497. Closing the Gates, Assassinating Zhang Yi. Strictly speaking, this was an unprecedented internal conflict in Celestial Seal sect. No matter which side won, it would completely change the direction and fate of Celestial Seal sect in the future. Other than the battles related to Zhang Yi, there were many other battles or confrontations happening in Celestial Seal sect. Since Li Daoji appeared, used his sword to destroy multiple seals, and killed Cheng Qingye, to the black-robed old man being convinced by the master of Celestial Seal sect, this internal conflict had truly ended. Their opinions were united, and there were no more battles or confrontations. Dying did not mean true death. Multiple Celestial Seal sect cultivators skilled in healing appeared from various places. As they took over from Li Daoji to treat the wounds of Zhang Yi and the others, they looked at Chun Xingxue's cold corpse with an inexplicable gaze. They were thinking of Chun Xingxue, who they should be treating right now. Zhang Yi was carried out of Celestial Ascension Hall. He was also being treated, but his wounds were not as serious as Su Qin's. He tried to raise his body and thank Su Qin. Then he could not help but ask, "Why are you helping me?" Even though they had been in the same sect in the past, from the moment Su Qin left Chongling to the events in Celestial Seal sect, he knew that Su Qin would not think of him as a friend and would not risk his life to save him. In his opinion, this was definitely very abnormal, or even something that was simply impossible. Su Qin looked coldly at him, and a hint of disdain appeared at the corners of his mouth. He turned his head and looked in the direction of Chongling. "You may not have heard, but your junior sect brother Ding Ning is dead," he said slowly with a hint of pleasure. Zhang Yi's body stopped at this moment. He maintained his slightly raised posture and stopped there. For a seriously injured and dying person like him, maintaining such a posture would be more difficult than sitting up. Yet he stopped there like this, as though it had nothing to do with his body's condition. "What did you say?" Zhang Yi looked at Su Qin and asked as if he didn't hear him clearly. "Ding Ning is dead." Su Qin did not look at him and laughed. He was used by someone on the battlefield to break the seal of the Tianliang ancestral lands and died in the Tianliang ancestral lands. "It is precisely because he is dead that I must save you. At least for now, as long as you are alive, I am of value to the mistress of Chongling." "I'm only valuable if you're alive." Su Qin repeated this sentence, and then coldly mocked himself. "Otherwise, I would be a dog that was casually abandoned here." "Impossible." Zhang Yi suddenly struggled. He wanted to sit up and ask Li Daoji, but this struggle caused him to fall heavily onto the stretcher. "Other than the fact that you have Min Mountain Sword Sect's sword manual, she wants to kill you because Ding Ning is dead. In her view, leaving you alive is a future trouble. She does not need to care about Ding Ning's feelings after killing you." Su Qin turned to look at Zhang Yi, who was almost unable to breathe, and said coldly, "Otherwise, why would she kill you?" Zhang Yi's chest and head felt tearing pain. His rationality, including his intuition, told him that Su Qin was not lying, but he still could not believe it. He used all his strength to shout, "Sect Uncle!" The Yin Imperial Palace. Outside the Imperial Study was the Imperial Garden. There was a path paved with white jade that passed through the Imperial Garden. There was a white jade bridge that passed through the pond. The white jade was carved with dragons, phoenixes, and auspicious clouds. It was usually beautiful and peaceful, exuding majesty. At this moment, the Imperial Garden was littered with the fragments of corpses and weapons. Apart from the Imperial Study and the white jade bridge that led to the study, the rest of the scenery had been completely torn apart by the Yuan Qi of heaven and earth. The thick blood covered the patterns of the relief sculpture. Pieces of flesh and organs floated in the air, as if the garden was covered with a thick blanket. Multiple powerful cultivators had all kinds of terrifying wounds. The primal energies of the universe around them were uncontrollably turbulent, turning into all kinds of lights and clouds. They looked like demons, but their eyes were filled with despair and anger. The paths and roof tiles around the Imperial Palace reflected the cold flashes of weapons and seal weapons. These flashes of light were like waves, carrying with them an incomparably heavy thickness. They pressed down on their surroundings, turning this courtyard into the last isolated island. The ground was trembling slightly. There was an enormous roar of metal slowly approaching, indicating that some powerful seal weapons were advancing. Zhongshu Marquis, a bright yellow figure, appeared at the ruined entrance to the Imperial Garden. One of the many powerful cultivators in the garden shouted angrily. This was a middle-aged man with a white face and no beard, extremely handsome. But even more importantly, he wore the bright yellow 9 dragon robe. In the Yin dynasty, only the Emperor of Yin could wear this robe, and it represented the unique power of the Emperor. For the officials loyal to the Emperor of Yin, this was disobedience and naked disrespect. But hearing such a furious shout, the white-faced man who appeared at the entrance to the Imperial Garden covered in flesh and corpses smiled warmly. At this point, you still care about this? He looked warmly and sympathetically at these cultivators. At the same time, he looked with great sincerity at the tightly closed Imperial study and said, "Imperial brother, are you really going to wait until everyone is dead before you come out and abdicate?" His voice was gentle, but in the pool of blood, he appeared cold-blooded and powerful. The door to the Imperial study was still closed, and there was no response from inside. Zhongshu Marquis of Great Yin, this marquis, who was given a title in another county, but suddenly came back to the imperial city and started an unprecedented mutiny. He did not get angry, but just smiled gently and said, "I don't understand what you are waiting for." After saying this, he raised his right hand that was hanging by his side. But at this time, a light but authoritative voice came from the imperial study. After the Deer Mountain Conference, even after the new emperor of Chu ascended the throne, there was no rebellion. In terms of stability, the Yin is the first. No one dares to rebel in the other dynasties. I want to know why only you rebels dare to rebel in the Yin? As this voice sounded, the door to the imperial study silently opened. A similarly bright yellow figure appeared at the door to the imperial study. The Zhongshu Marquis' pupils contracted slightly, but his warm smile was still there. He said disdainfully, "Imperial brother, do you want me to speak the truth? You are the Emperor of Yin. No matter compared to the former Emperor of Chu, or Yuan Wu and the others, you have a fatal weakness. Your cultivation is the lowest of all the emperors of the dynasties. Even the woman who is actually in power in Chu has a higher cultivation than you. If your cultivation is not enough, you cannot convince the masses. Even more importantly, you cannot stop people from wanting to kill you." The Zhongshu Marquis paused and then smiled proudly. He said, "But if I become the new emperor of the Yin, there will be no such problem." Really? What he didn't expect was that there was no despair on Emperor Yan's face. Instead, there was a hint of mockery. The Emperor of Yin looked mockingly at him and raised his head slightly. He said, "My cultivation is the lowest among the emperors of the dynasties, but I am not as stupid as them. Even more importantly, your cultivation is not the strongest in the Yin dynasty. That's why someone dreamed of a mountain, but you didn't notice it." The Zhongshu Marquis unconsciously frowned. He could not understand the meaning of the Emperor of Yan's words. "I've only come out now not because I'm afraid or have a sliver of hope. It's because I want to see clearly how many people will truly stand on my side in the end. How many people I usually trust will stand on your side." There was an uncontrollable anger in the Emperor of Yan's voice. The Zhongshu Marquis' body suddenly felt cold. He was filled with a sense of foreboding. His right hand quickly rose up. However, it was also at this moment that his body froze slightly. A wave of shocked shouts sounded. A thick wave of blackness and true coldness flooded out of the imperial study. The imperial study was easily torn apart like a piece of paper. Even the cultivators who had stubbornly guarded the study turned around, their eyes filled with disbelief and shock. It was like a primordial beast had appeared out of thin air. A mountain appeared where the imperial study was. A true black mountain. Chapter 498. The Black Mountain was not tall, not even as tall as the tallest hall in the Yin Palace. However, This black mountain brought a terrifying pressure to the senses of all the cultivators present. At this time, inside and outside the Yin Palace, many people had been to Deer Mountain and seen Yuanwu fight with the top grandmasters of the world. When the presence of the Black Mountain rose, these people uncontrollably trembled. This unique, ghostly aura came from Qi. Only that grandmaster of the Qi dynasty had a Black Mountain like this. That Qi grandmaster had proven to the world at the Deer Mountain Conference that he was the strongest of all the grandmasters in attendance other than Yuanwu. The imperial study was destroyed, and what replaced it was the rise of the Black Mountain. There were no plants on this not tall Black Mountain, but there were countless tombstones. Each tombstone was different in terms of shape and material, and they were all wrapped in different black flames. Streaks of black flames that were equally sinister, but had completely different auras swayed wantonly on the mountain like wild grass. Zhongshu Marquis looked up at the Black Mountain. His eyes narrowed, and his eyebrows turned white. He had endured half his life in the border city of the Yin to plan for today's situation. Now, he saw success, but the Black Mountain suddenly appeared. How could he not be anxious, angry, and old? The Emperor of Yin looked at him with disdain. Looking at the wrinkles that suddenly appeared on his face and his brows that suddenly turned white, he said scornfully, "You know you do not have much time. Soon my Silver Cliff army will come back. If you do not surrender now, what do you want to do?" After his voice rang out, the cold metallic light in the palace scattered like a tide rushing onto a beach. In the end, it powerlessly turned into bubbles and completely disappeared. On the Zhongshu Marquis' cold face, there was a hint of scorn and fanaticism in his smile. He looked at the Emperor of Yin and shook his head seriously. He said, "I still want to try." The Emperor of Yin sneered. "Try?" Zhongshu Marquis nodded and said coldly, "He is not Yining. Everyone knows that Yining is dead." The Emperor of Yin did not speak. He had already sensed the change in the Black Mountain behind him. He knew that there was no need for him to respond. On the Black Mountain, all the tombstones began to tremble and sway. Black dust and soil constantly trembled at the bottom of the tombstone. Streaks of gloomy and cold aura did not rush into the sky, but into the depths of the earth where the senses of cultivators could not reach. Countless cultivators inside and outside the palace turned pale with fright. In their perception, this Black Mountain had turned the entire imperial palace into hell. The invisible Yin energy that filled the entire imperial palace even prevented some seal weapons and flying swords from being used. Zhongshu Marquis lowered his head. His black hair also turned white at this moment. His hands pressed down on the ground in front of him. A tiny and translucent Vajra pestle fell from his fingertips. Everything in the Imperial Garden that had not shattered, including the white jade bridge that had remained intact during the battle, shattered into thousands of pieces. The experts guarding in front of the Emperor of Yin all vomited blood and flew back uncontrollably with shouts. The Emperor of Yin gave a muffled grunt. Countless fine bubbles appeared in the air in front of him and spread like boiling water. When these scenes happened, a muffled boom came from the ground in front of Zhongshu Marquis. When the tiny and translucent Vajra pestle fell from his fingertips, it was as small as a fingernail. But when it landed, it was as tall as a person, like a small glowing tower. The sky turned golden, and many streaks of flame appeared. The coldness of the Yin capital suddenly disappeared as though the heat was coming. That was because those golden flames were the true Grand Sun, primordial fire. Zhongshu Marquis looked expressionlessly at the Black Mountain and the sun fire that followed his will to swarm over. The Qi dynasty, especially the Yin and ghost path of the Black Mountain, was the strangest cultivation method in the world. What it attracted was the Yin energy left in the world by dead cultivators or powerful beasts. This kind of Yin and nether energy was most afraid of the sun fire, so he used the sun fire to defeat it. In the blink of an eye, countless streams of condensed Grand Sun, primordial fire, fell onto the Black Mountain like spears. The Black Mountain was immediately pierced with holes. Countless tombstones were broken. No dirt or stone flew up from where the holes were pierced, but thick smoke rose. Zhongshu Marquis' vital energy surged out of his body. His entire body turned transparent and shone like a god. Seeing such a scene, the rebel army surrounding the imperial garden cheered. Many cultivators sensed that the energy filling the imperial palace was dissipating. The darkness in their hearts faded, and their confidence recovered. The Black Mountain was in ruins, and would turn to smoke and black ash at any moment. But at this time, in a valley near the top of the Black Mountain, a low shadow slowly split open. A black-haired youth sat up on the ground, as if he had just woken up from a long slumber. His face was very white, so white it was almost transparent. There was life in his eyes, but there was no life in his body, not even a hint of warmth, like the frost on a tombstone in winter. Because his skin was too bloodless and not pale at all, one could even clearly see the blood vessels in his flesh. The blood vessels in his flesh and blood were all black. What flowed through his veins was not bright red blood, but black chi flames. The cheers suddenly stopped. This youth stood up. His black hair was so long that it was taller than him, and it reached the ground behind him. His face was young, about the same age as Ding Ning and the others. But at this time, his black hair, his skin, and his flesh gave him an eerie and powerful presence. The moment he stood up, a patch of black clouds appeared in the sky. The black clouds blocked the sun fire falling from the sky, and more importantly, the sunlight was no longer blinding. The young man opened his eyes completely. It wasn't just his pupils. His entire eyeball was pitch black, as dark as ink. Then he saw the Zhongshu Marquis clearly. With a step, he walked from the valley towards the Zhongshu Marquis. When he took a step forward, the Black Mountain disappeared and turned into a cloud of thick black smoke, gathering towards his body. In everyone's vision and perception, this Black Mountain entered his body with a single step. This Black Mountain seemed to be a part of him, or rather, it was his life bond item. The Zhongshu Marquis' face paled. He did not sense the presence of a life bond item, but his cultivation and perception clearly reminded him that this Black Mountain had completely merged with the other. This Black Mountain and most of the cultivation of the Grandmaster had been passed onto the other's body. He did not sense the presence of a life bond item because the ghostly method of the top Grandmaster of Qi was completely different from any cultivation method in the world and did not walk the same path. There was no doubt that the youth he was facing had directly surpassed the barrier of level 7 and become the youngest Grandmaster in the world. His heart began to beat violently. This was not a breakthrough and could not be explained with reason, but it was very real. In the next moment, he let out a shrill howl and faced the youth who was coming with the Black Mountain. He stretched out his right hand, and between his middle finger and index finger, there was a thin piece of tattered talisman paper. He slashed it towards the youth. The thin talisman paper emitted a terrifying talisman intent. The world was cut in half. Countless gravestones suddenly floated in front of this seal essence. Gravestones filled the world. Countless gravestones were cut in half and turned to black smoke. But in the black smoke, the youth with black hair that reached the ground was in front of the Zhongshu Marquis. The Zhongshu Marquis' eyes narrowed into slits, and flames came out of his eyes. Behind him, in the empty air, a shadow appeared out of thin air. This shadow was very short, a dwarf. However, there was a very long sword in his hand. This sword was extremely fast and rivaled Yintai Guanjian's sword light during the Min Mountain Sword Trials. With a flash, this sword light passed by the Zhongshu Marquis' waist and stabbed into the youth's chest. But in this moment, the flames in the Zhongshu Marquis' eyes turned into shock and even despair. Chapter 499. The sword light pierced into the young man's chest, and the terrifying power of the sword began to destroy the young man's flesh and meridians. Because the speed of the sword was too fast, when it pierced into the young man's chest, it had already pierced through the young man's body, leaving behind a gaping wound. But this youth did not die. His movements did not even change. In Zhongshu Marquis' perception, This youth's flesh and blood were filled with countless gravestones. Then the youth's hand fell down. An enormous black gravestone appeared in the youth's hand. This gravestone smashed onto Zhongshu Marquis's body, and also onto the dwarf behind him who had attacked so quickly. There was an explosion. Zhongshu Marquis and the dwarf seemed to be hit by a black mountain. The ground under the two completely exploded, sinking down dozens of feet. Then in the next moment, it exploded outwards like a wave. Zhongshu Marquis and the dwarf vomited blood. Their bodies half sank into the ground as they plowed backwards. The dwarf was behind Zhongshu Marquis, but his cultivation was much weaker than Zhongshu Marquis. So when his body plowed backwards, he was already dead. His body could not withstand any more power, and in the next moment, he exploded from the inside out, turning into a bloody mist. All the cultivators who could see the scene in the Imperial Garden were shocked. Even the Emperor of Yen could not disguise the shock in his eyes. No one knew the origins of this dwarf. In this moment, no one even saw his face clearly, but everyone knew that he was a terrifying swordsman, a Realm 7 Grandmaster. This Grandmaster, whom many Realm 7 cultivators present did not even detect how he had arrived, was killed by this youth with one blow. Even more astounding was that the wound through the youth's chest was still there. This Grandmaster's blow was enough to kill any powerful cultivator. Even Yuan Wu could not survive such a blow. However, the young man was still standing there unharmed. Zhongshu Marquis's body retreated dozens of feet, passing through the bloody mist that the dwarf had turned into, and then stopped. There were continuous explosions coming from his body. Streams of energy stabbed out of his body like sharp swords. What kind of technique is this? He knew he was about to die. His strong unwillingness made him raise his head with difficulty. Looking at the wound on the youth's chest, he said, "How can you not die?" The young man with black hair that reached the ground looked at the dying hero and shook his head, saying, "No one can avoid death. It's just that there are some techniques that lead to life through death." Facing death to live? Zhongshu Marquis looked at the youth. His body shook as though he understood the meaning of the words. But in the next moment, he hung his head and died. The Yin Emperor also understood the meaning of these words. His expression was stern as he looked at the youth who had brought Black Mountain here. Thinking of everything the other had given up, he could not help but feel great respect. Then, he raised his head and looked at one of the halls in the palace. That palace was where the rebel army was located. Zhongshu Marquis was dead. The rebel army did not have a leader, but that did not mean there was no new leader in the rebel army. In front of the palace, there were 3 black iron towers that were almost as tall as the palace. These 3 tower-shaped seal weapons were inscribed with simple seal scripts. Each tower had a dozen lotus-like seats on it. Cultivators of the 6th realm sat cross-legged on these seats. The vital essence in their bodies continued to flow into the practitioner weapon. The enormous towers roared like lava was hitting each other. The tops of the towers gradually lit up as though something terrifying was about to surge out of the towers. There were several cultivators standing in front of the 3 towers. The one in the lead wore bronze armor. His extremely cold face was filled with countless complicated emotions at the moment. He was the great Yin dynasty's border marshal Yu Qi. Many powerful cultivators at the border had been able to appear here and start a rebellion because he had assisted Zhongshu Marquis. Now that Zhongshu Marquis had died, he naturally became the new leader of the rebel army. Yu Qi was one of the Yin Emperor's most important generals. He led 3 of the 7 border armies of the Yin. No one knew why he had betrayed the Yin Emperor. But as the 3 sky-reaching towers were activated, everyone knew he could not stop. Everyone knew he would rather die in battle in order to kill the Yin Emperor before the outside armies arrived. At this time, he suddenly looked up. The sky turned black. This was a terrifying seal essence. It didn't just distort the sunlight above the Yin Imperial Palace. It even cut off the primal energies of the universe gathered by the 3 powerful seal weapons. Yu Qi felt a great chill in his heart. He sensed killing intent coming from behind him. The moment he turned around, he heard several shouts from his subordinates. A black-robed man appeared among the Yin border army generals behind the 3 seal weapons. This man had an indescribable noble aura as he walked gently between the cultivators. The cultivators behind him were like crumpled paper balls, their bodies curled up, and with terrifying sounds of bones cracking, they collapsed and died. Like the Zhongshu Marquis, Yu Qi was not an ordinary cultivator. So in this moment, he understood that this black-robed man came from Chongling. Sensing the darkness that came from the heavens but covered everything like the heaviest curtain of night, he also understood why the Black Mountain was able to silently enter the imperial palace. Chongling's old nobility, the Qi dynasty, the Black Mountain. Many chaotic scenes flashed through Yu Qi's mind, but a certain thought became unusually clear. He looked at the black-robed man and grimaced. So the Yin and Qi had been standing side by side for a long time. The black-robed man was not as tall as him, but when he looked at him at the same level, he seemed to be looking down on him. He responded coolly to Yu Qi. If Yuan Wu had not reached Realm 8, he would have died at the Deer Mountain Conference. Zheng Xiao may have died as well. Yu Qi was silent for a moment. Then he looked at the black-robed man and said, I do not think as much as you. For personal grievances, that is good. But if you do not think big enough, you will not see far enough. So you will not succeed. The black-robed man looked at him and said seriously. Yu Qi was silent for a moment and said, You are right. I do not want to kill you. The black-robed man looked at him and said slowly, Since you cannot succeed, you do not need to make unnecessary sacrifices. Even if you are going to die, you do not need to take many people, including the entire Yin dynasty, to die with you. Yu Qi thought for a moment. Before he spoke, the black-robed man continued, No matter what grievances you have with the Yin Emperor, your grievances are just a part of Zheng Xiao's plan. Since you will fail, you do not need to drag many subordinates loyal to you, including their families and brothers, to die with you. I can let you live. You are not living for yourself, but for these people, for the Yin dynasty. Yu Qi smiled bitterly and said seriously, What you said makes a lot of sense. I can't refuse. After saying this, he gave multiple military orders. The black-robed man bowed to him in thanks. Then he opened a path for this border army commander to leave with some of his loyal subordinates. The blackness in the sky was still there. The blackness in the imperial gardens was still there. The contrast between heaven and earth was enough to make one tremble in fear. A yellow-robed man stood in the streets of the Yin capital with an umbrella. He looked at the blackness in the imperial palace, and his hands trembled slightly. A yellow leaf fell from the locust tree behind him and was turned to powder by his trembling physical energy. In the imperial palace of Chongling, yellow leaves fell like rain. A yellow-robed man walked along the stone path and respectfully handed a document to the palace attendant outside the emperor's study. In Chongling, yellow robes did not mean the imperial family, but the emperor's family in Jiaodong Commandery. The empress looked at the document the palace attendant handed her. A strange emotion appeared on her perfect and cold face. This emotion seemed to be emotion and also anger. Or maybe it was just a moment of days of memories. She was the only one who knew what it was. Ever since Yuan Wu ascended the throne, and the Bazin Kendo ground was destroyed in her hands, she gradually felt that everything was in her control. Even without that person, everything was as she wished. She seemed to be a god with the mandate of the heavens, omnipotent. But ever since the Min Mountain sword trial started, she seemed to have been losing. The more she lost, the stronger the shadow that person left in her heart became, and spread out as though it would take over her entire body. She threw the document into the brazier in front of her, and then slowly stood. She walked out of the study, towards the back of the study, and deeper into the imperial palace. Deeper into the imperial palace, there was a special torture room. Chapter 500. This torture room was deep in the inner palace. In the previous emperor's time, it had been a cold palace. At this time, it was wrapped tightly by a vine called the acacia vine. There was only one way in and out. The vines of the acacia vine were a parasitic plant that could be described as greedy. These vines parasitized all plants that could be parasitized. When the surrounding plants were sucked dry of nutrients and died, these vines started to parasitize each other. The result of parasitizing each other was that only the thickest vine was left. When it lost its host, it would not take root in the soil and would wither completely. So the final result of this vine's growth was to destroy all the plants in the surroundings that could be parasitized, and then destroy itself, unless someone deliberately provided it with trees to parasitize. Obviously, someone had deliberately provided a host for the vines in this cold palace. Therefore, the scene was like a gathering place for lonely souls and wild ghosts described in many storybooks. Withered trees and vines gathered together, while dozens of living vines were full of vitality. Their purplish-red skin looked like it was dripping blood. When the Empress stepped into this cold palace, these vines seemed to come alive and trembled in joy. These vines pierced through the sleeping quarters in the cold palace. The ceiling of the sleeping quarters was covered in withered vines and living vines, and the withered leaves formed a carpet below. Unlike the withered leaves of ordinary trees, the leaves of these vines were dark red, even when they were withered, seeming to indicate the blood and cruelty of their growth. Shenxian stood above the dark red withered leaves, his head bowed. Hearing the familiar footsteps, his expression did not change. Only his eyes were dyed dark red, and gave off an eerie and fanatical light. I do not completely believe the process of Gu Huai's death you speak of, the Empress' voice sounded, because I understand Gu Huai. If he did not have the ability to defeat Zhang Mok, he would not have risked entering the Mountain of Ancestors. The Empress stopped at the door of the sleeping quarters. Her beautiful eyes looked emotionlessly at Sun Xian, who had his head bowed, waiting for his answer. Her appearance seemed to grow more perfect. But because she was more perfect, she did not seem like a person of the world, but a god. Sun Xian was silent for a rare moment in front of her. Then he slowly said, "You are right. I did conceal some things. I also acted against Gu Huai." "Why?" The Empress glanced at him and said, "You should know what Gu Huai means to me and the entire Qin dynasty." Her voice was calm and emotionless. She wasn't even surprised. Yet even though this was something Sun Xian had expected, he still couldn't help but feel cold. He did not control his body's reaction and let his body tremble slightly due to the real fear. "Because I have selfish motives?" He took a deep breath, his head still bowed. He said, "I want to live. I want to return to Chongling." The Empress quietly raised her head. Her extremely beautiful eyelashes fluttered slightly. Then she looked at the master of the great floating water prison who had lost an arm. She asked simply, "Gu Huai is dead. Why are you alive? Why do you dare to return to Chongling?" Sun Xian was silent for a moment. Then he looked up and met her gaze. He said, "In my view, with Gu Huai dead, I may become more important in Chongling. This is still my selfishness. You should know that I do not want to be trapped in that dark water prison for the rest of my life." The Empress looked calmly at him and said, "More important? What do you really want?" Sun Xian bowed his head and said, "Secretariat Director." The Empress' beautiful eyelashes fluttered again, even more urgently. Her perfect face even paled a little, and there was a hint of anger and coldness in it. Secretariat Director. This was a position that had never existed in the Qin dynasty. It was just that person's idea. After Yuanwu ascended the throne and she officially became the Empress, no one dared to mention it in front of her. In all of Chongling, in court, no one dared to mention that person or the ideas that were closely related to that person. Sun Xian did not look up. He took a deep breath and said, "I brought back the heaven-replenishing divine art." The Empress grew silent. When she fell silent, the air in the entire hall became even colder. All of the air was forced away by a kind of netherworld cold that came from the extremely high starry sky. Sun Xian held his breath. He knew that she was weighing and thinking. All he could do was wait for the final life and death. That wine shop youth is really dead. The Empress was silent for a moment, looking at him and asking this question. Sun Xian nodded with difficulty and said, "Wuji can also prove it." The Empress looked at him and said, "But you still need to prove yourself. Even if you brought back the heaven-replenishing divine art, this is just a condition you gave in exchange. I still cannot completely trust you." Shen Xian looked up at her and said seriously, I understand. So, I only need to prove that I will not hate you. The Empress nodded in satisfaction. Shen Xian bowed. Then a pure life bond presence appeared on his hand. A dark red withered leaf floated up from the ground and landed in his hand. It gradually shone with a red jade-like light and became as heavy as jade. The surface of the leaf was covered in characters and lines carved according to his will. An indescribable fanaticism appeared in the Empress' cold eyes. This was the heaven-replenishing divine art that person wanted to study but did not obtain in the end. Now, it was finally in her hands. When this red jade-like leaf landed in her hand, and she sensed the presence rippling from the profound lines, her body trembled slightly. She was certain that this record was not fake. She did not say anything else and turned to leave. Official Shun, please excuse me. A yellow-robed cultivator walked out of the vines and smiled at Shen Xian. He opened the box he carried with him and brazenly opened it in front of Shen Xian. Then he roughly inserted a bottle of medicinal liquid through a hollow needle into a vein on Shen Xian's neck. Shen Xian gave a hurried grunt. His feet were like iron hammers as he hammered the ground. Official Shun, you taught me these moves. Similarly, I am here thanks to you. Lord Shen, compared to me, you're still lucky. As long as you can make it through, as long as you say the same thing as what you said to the Empress, there's still a great future waiting for you outside. Therefore, Lord Shen, please don't hate me. Seeing Shen Xian's face twist in pain, the yellow-robed cultivator laughed. His features were twisted and filled with cruelty and pleasure. In the next moment, he did not care about Shen Xian's feelings at all. A powerful life bond presence spread from his body. The enormous vines hanging above suddenly moved like pythons and fell down, binding Shen Xian tightly and hanging him up. Dozens of steel needles pierced deep into Shen Xian's body. The different medicinal powers caused Shen Xian's body to twist and even start to tear. This yellow-robed cultivator did not even make any extra movements. Because of his violent twisting, Shen Xian was a bloody mess and could not be seen. This was the most secret place to extort confessions. There were too many astounding secrets here. So this yellow-robed cultivator arranged here could only be trapped here for his entire life, and would never be able to walk out of the cold palace alive. He was Shen Xian's subordinate, but since he lived here, could not leave the cold palace, and could never come into contact with the outside world, he naturally did not need to care about Shen Xian. But he had not expected that Shen Xian did not feel any hatred towards him at this time. Because in the past many years, Shen Xian had been waiting for a chance like this, a chance to prove himself. He had used a lot of time to practice so he could endure such torture and say what he wanted to say. At this moment, although he was enduring unimaginable pain, his mind still maintained a trace of clarity. No one would be able to tell that there was even a trace of a mocking smile on his mangled face. What do you really want? The Empress' voice seemed to echo in the cold palace. Honored Empress, I have served you for so long. Have you never considered, or disdained to consider, and think that I am not worthy of considering what I really want? Why do some people know what I really want? This is the difference between you and others. Just like right now, you're using such a method to make me prove that in your eyes, I'm nothing more than a dispensable dog. I'm no different from those yellow-gowned men. Shen Xian smiled coldly. Chapter 501. A carriage was passing through a mountain pass. This side of the mountain pass was the territory of the Qin dynasty, and the other side was the territory of the Chu dynasty. A Qin general rode on a horse and looked at the carriage heading towards the Chu. His red cape flapped in the wind like a war banner. In the previous chaos in Chongling, we lost to the Chu and were forced to give up Yangshan Commandery. For the Qin army, this is a great humiliation. But in my view, today's humiliation is even greater than Yangshan Commandery being given up. This Qin general looked down and said coldly, that wine shop youth's cultivation advancement in Chongling, and everything he did before and after the Min Mountain Sword trials is admirable. On the Wuji battlefield, he achieved great feats. Yet after he died in battle, his only relative was sent to the Chu as a secret exchange. She is very cold, so cold that people cannot help but think of what will happen to the people around them after they die. I heard that back then. Li Lingjun asked for this woman at Falling Parasol, but this wine shop youth retorted with a few words. That wine shop youth was not even a cultivator back then, but he was able to protect the Chongling woman. Now, we have strong soldiers, but we have to watch this woman be sent to the Chu. So sad and laughable. There were many generals behind this Qin border general who were waiting on horseback like him. But when they heard his furious words, they did not speak. One reason was because they did not have such high status and did not dare to judge so directly. Two was because they knew that if they could not control their emotions, they would cause this general's emotions to worsen and be harder to control. In the carriage, Zhang Sun Qinxue sat coldly as usual. She was about to go to the Chu. This was the first time she had left the Qin dynasty and entered the territory of another dynasty. For her, leaving Chongling had a different meaning. I accepted your arrangements because even Gu Huai died at your hands. I acknowledge your abilities, but this does not mean I have forgiven you. Horses whinnied in front of the carriage. Zhang Sun Qinxue sensed a familiar presence. She looked up slightly. A layer of frost flashed on her unforgettable, beautiful face. A group of Chu soldiers was waiting. After the document was handed over, a middle-aged man who looked like a strategist came to the carriage that had stopped in front of the Chu dynasty. He lifted the curtain and glanced at Zhang Sun Qinxue. He nodded at the Chu generals as though he was confirming something. But then he did not return to the chariot he had been on before. He boldly bent into the carriage and sat down opposite Zhang Sun Qinxue. The carriage was not wide for the two people. The middle-aged man nodded in greeting. His voice was filled with emotion, but it only echoed in the carriage. Long time no see. This was the tone of a true old friend. So this was a true old friend. I had not expected you to still be alive. Zhang Sun Qinxue did not look at this middle-aged man whose hair was white. She turned her head in disgust and looked at the curtain swaying in the wind. She said coldly, Lin Zhujiu put in a lot of effort in arranging for you to meet me. But other than meeting a few more times, is there any difference between you and them to me? The middle-aged man smiled bitterly. After a moment of silence, he looked at her and said seriously, in reality, you should not hate him because there are some things you do not understand. Zhang Sun Qinxue frowned in even more disgust. She said, these are matters that have already been decided. Is there any meaning in mentioning these things? The middle-aged man's expression grew more solemn. He nodded and said, even if these are matters of the past, everything is right and wrong. Lin Zhujiu had me come to see you, not because I once studied with you and am your senior sect brother, but because you should know that I never lie. Zhang Sun Qinxue was silent, because she knew this man spoke the truth. This man also came from the old nobility and had once shared a master with her. But in the end, he became close to the Bazinkindo ground. His name was Gong Shuji. Originally, one of the positions of the two ministers should have been his, not because of his birth and cultivation, but because of his straightforwardness. He always spoke of right and wrong and never lied. You do not know everything about what happened in the past, or rather, it is one-sided. Gong Shuji looked at the silent her and slowly said, it was his idea for the Shang family to lead the reform. But the Shang family offended the interests of most of the nobility. In order to temporarily avoid chaos and calm some people's anger, the Shang family was made the scapegoat. This had nothing to do with him. At the time, he was in the Chu. When he received the news and returned, the Shang family only had an orphan girl left. Because of this, he was on the verge of breaking with Yuan Wu. The world thought that he would do anything to achieve his goal, but in reality, his mistake was to believe Jing Xiu. Gong Shuji looked at Zhang Sun Qinxue, whose lips were tightly pressed together. He slowly said, that year, when he fought with the Wei, he had Zheng Xiu stay in Chongling to restrain Yuan Wu. In reality, at that time, he and your family, including the other families, had almost finished their discussions. They had discussed what each family would do in Chongling in the future, and made them marquises. As long as the Qin dynasty can continue to expand, the land will not be completely sealed. Gong Shuji looked at Zhang Sun Qinxue, whose eyelashes were starting to flutter. He took a deep breath and slowly said, but he did not expect Zheng Xiao to stand with Yuan Wu. He did not know that 4 great families were destroyed in one night. This was the key to his complete break with Yuan Wu. The last thing he and Zheng Xiao planned was for the Bazinkindo ground to peacefully leave Chongling. But he had not expected Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiao to attack first. Zhang Sun Qinshua's lips were pressed into a line, but the corners of her lips trembled. You say that he did not know anything about these things? If you do not even believe what I say, there is another person who can prove it. Gong Shuji looked at her, who finally spoke, and said seriously, Yi Xiao knows that these matters have nothing to do with him. Zhang Sun Qinxue looked up. This is already a matter that has been decided. Is there any meaning in mentioning this? She slowly said this again. This was the second time she had said this. Of course there is meaning. Gong Shuji looked at her and said softly. He was in a hurry to return to Chongling because he feared you would risk your life to fight Zheng Xiao. But in the end, he did not expect Zheng Xiao to be so cold and use the lives of so many people to force him to appear. Zhang Sun Qinxue was silent. The cold wind beat against the window curtains. The light that occasionally passed through the window was unusually blinding and made people's eyes ache. However, Gong Shuji did not stop there. He looked at her even more seriously and said directly, You should know that he did not treat you like Miss Shang, out of guilt. He always admired you, but because he met Zheng Xiao first, he could not accept your feelings, so he could only think of you as a confidant. At least, in my view, if there was no Zheng Xiao, if he did not meet Zheng Xiao, the first person he would like would be you. Chapter 502. To seriously discuss whether a person who is no longer in the world liked someone back then, whether he treated that person as an ordinary friend or a confidant, especially if one of his lovers did not exist, and if he would fall in love with someone else, this seemed to be a very boring matter. But this was very important to both sides. For Gong Shuji, this was one of the last wishes of the person he respected the most and followed his entire life. He knew that person back then had always wanted to find Zhang Sun Qinxue and resolve Zhang Sun Qinshue's misunderstanding of him. For Zhang Sun Qinxue, the meaning was even greater. She was the eldest miss of the Gongsun family in Chongling. Before the rise of the Bazinkindo ground and the Yuanwu reform, the most powerful people in Chongling were the old nobility led by the Gongsun family. Her status was even nobler than the princess of the Qin dynasty. She met that person and fell hopelessly in love with that person. However, when that man walked together with Zheng Xiao, not only did he reject her love, he even turned around and destroyed the Gongsun family. The enormous Gongsun family had so many people, but in the end, she was the only one left. Even more importantly, the Gongsun family had once had a chance to deal with him. Because of her relationship with that person, they gave up on a killing plot and allowed that person to grow. From a certain point of view, the Gongsun family believed that person's feelings for her. Even if Zheng Xiao was there first, he would not betray her. Being rejected, being deceived, and being used were completely different things. She was silent at this moment, but her tightly pursed lips couldn't help but tremble slightly. You should know him well. If he was not the person you thought he was, Zheng Xiao's method would not have succeeded. He would not have been willing to die in battle in Chongling to save some people. Looking at Zhang Sun Qinxue, whose lips were trembling, Gong Shuji did not stop speaking. He looked at Zhang Sun Qinxue and said directly, from a certain point of view, Zheng Xiao is more mature than you. She understands him better than you. The temperature in the carriage plummeted. True blue-black ice appeared in the carriage along with Zhang Sun Qinshue's breathing. There was no change outside the carriage, but within the cramped space of the carriage, there was a terrifying killing intent. Zhang Sun Qinxue said slowly and coldly, Are you saying that I shouldn't have suspected him at all? He was the person in charge of all of Chongling back then. While young, he was the leader that all of you respected. My family was massacred in Chongling. You tell me that I should not suspect him? Time will tell. Gong Suji knew that she could easily kill him with her present cultivation, but he did not feel any fear. He looked seriously at her and slowly said, At least, when he died in battle in Chongling, you should have understood. Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiu burned so many books and killed so many people. Did they not want to push the blame on him? Zhang Sun Qinxue took a deep breath. The blue-black ice and snow in the carriage disappeared. She shook her head coldly and said, "Maybe he does not think so. Maybe he wants to live after death. Maybe the 9-death silkworm has a way to revive the dead." Gong Suji looked at her like he was looking at a monster. There is no way to revive the dead in the world. Even if there is, when a person's physical body and mind have completely collapsed, to revive the dead, that is a truly heaven-defying method. I fear this is no different from ascending to the legendary Realm 9. Who can guarantee that nothing will go wrong? If one cannot guarantee that nothing will go wrong, who will die first and then live and use their own life as a bet? After a pause, he could not help but have some disdain at the corners of his mouth. If it was Zheng Xiu or Yuan Wu, they would naturally endure and find a perfect opportunity to counterattack and take revenge. Zhang Sun Qinxue was silent for a long time and said, "Just like how he trusted Zheng Xiu, after many years, the only thing I learned is to not easily trust anyone. I want to see Yi Xiao. As long as you are willing." Gong Suji nodded again and said sincerely, "He should want to see you more." Zhang Sun Qinshue's expression recovered its usual coldness. Hearing the sound of the carriage wheels, she turned to look at the fluttering carriage curtains and said softly, "So the Bazin Kindo ground has not truly disappeared in these years. You could be in the Chu, and have the Chu and Zheng Xiu reach an agreement to send me safely to the Chu like a trade item. This means that all of the Chu dynasty belongs to the Bazin Kindo ground?" Gong Suji laughed. "You can say that." His smile was slightly bleak and without pride. He knew very well what price the Bazin Kindo ground had paid. Min Mountain Sword Sect, above the snow line. Bailey Sushue's figure was colder than an unmelting glacier. Jing Lioli stood below him, her body trembling slightly. Bailey Sushue also had a leaf in his hand. This leaf was also dark red, like it was made from dried blood, and also had many profound lines. Jing Lioli could not comprehend the meaning of these profound lines, but she had studied seal lines like this before, so she was familiar with the special presence these lines gave off. This could only be the ultimate skill of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Xin Xian had sent this leaf to Min Mountain Sword Sect before returning to the Imperial Palace. The heaven-replenishing divine art had landed in Xin Xian's hands. She found it hard to believe that the wine shop youth she had followed for a long time had died, but she believed that if he had not died, he would not have let the heaven-replenishing divine art land in Xin Xian's hands. Then what did Xin Xian mean by sending a leaf that represented the heaven-replenishing divine art in secret? Her emotions were too agitated and she couldn't figure it out. Ding Ning is not dead. Bailey Sushue's first words caused her to stop breathing, and she raised her head in disbelief. He is from the Bazin Kindo ground. Bailey Sushue's words caused her body to stiffen even more. Then Bailey Sushue looked at her and said, "Xin Xian chose the Bazin Kindo ground." Jing Lioli still could not understand and looked dazedly at Bailey Sushue. Bailey Sushue looked expressionlessly at the red leaf in his hand and watched it turn to ice in the cold. "The heaven-replenishing divine art has been changed." Hearing his words, Jing Lioli finally reacted. She struggled to breathe and said in a trembling voice, "This is the heaven-replenishing divine art that Ding Ning changed. He deliberately let this heaven-replenishing divine art land in Zheng Xiu's hands." Bailey Sushue looked at her and did not answer. But Jing Lioli, who was very familiar with him, saw the answer from his eyes. An indescribable feeling of ecstasy suddenly rose in her heart. "Master." She hesitated for a moment and looked at Bailey Sushue, asking, "Back then, what happened between you and that person from the Bazin Kindo ground? Why do you hate him so much?" Chapter 503. This was a secret of the past. Everyone wanted to know what kind of conflict had occurred between Bailey Sushue and that person back then, so much so that person could not enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to take a look. But almost no one dared, and no one had the chance to ask Bailey Sushue in person. There were many guesses in the cultivation world about the conflict between Bailey Sushue and that person. Most people felt that the most likely guess was that Bailey Sushue had fought that person before. Because when that person first became famous in Chongling, he sought out powerful swordsmen to challenge. Now, duels were common in Chongling, and even not accepting a challenge was thought to be a sign of weakness. Most people guessed that that person had challenged Bailey Sushue, and Bailey Sushue had been defeated and humiliated. So when that person wanted to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to take a look, Bailey Sushue closed the gates and refused to see him. That person was never able to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect. Even Jing Liuli guessed this, because when she asked, Bailey Sushue was silent. She could not help but ask, "Master, did he really challenge you?" A hint of a smile appeared at the corners of Bailey Sushue's mouth. When he smiled, the corners of his mouth were curled up and filled with pride. But his eyes were filled with emotion and disdain. He shook his head and said, "I did not fight him. I closed the gates and refused to see him because he was too stupid." Too stupid? Jing Lioli looked dazedly at him. She could not imagine. The entire world knew that person in the past was a peerless genius. No matter if it was his comprehension of cultivation or leading an army in battle, no one could compare to him. In her view, even her master, whom she respected to the extreme, did not seem to have the right to say that person was too stupid. Stupidity is stupidity. There is nothing to talk about in the past. Bailey Sushue turned around and did not speak. Jing Lioli looked at Bailey Sushue's back. She thought that he was looking silently at the ice and snow on the mountain peak. She did not know that he was looking at Chongling and the invisible imperial palace. The sunlight fell into the cold palace deep in Chongling's imperial palace. The blood-like acacia vines slowly retracted back to the beam and intertwined on the roof of the palace. On the torture bed below, a mangled figure, or rather, a lump of mangled flesh and blood, was constantly twisting and writhing, letting out mournful moans. The yellow-robed cultivator regretfully pulled out the thin needles in Xin Xian's flesh one by one. He did not even wipe away the blood before putting them into a metal box. The two recording officials were not like this yellow-robed cultivator, who could never leave this cold palace. They bowed respectfully to Xin Xian on the torture bed. As they retreated out of the palace, the two officials congratulated Xin Xian softly. "Congratulations, official Shun." When the two officials left, two more quickly walked in. One was an old medical officer who started to treat Xin Xian's injuries as quickly as possible. One of them was a clothing official, carrying all the cleansing items and a brand new set of official robes. The smell of blood in the cold palace was washed away, and it was filled with the unique smell of some rare spiritual herbs. The painful groans in Shun Xian's mouth slowly disappeared and turned into heavy breathing. "Official Shun, bear with it. Your suffering is over, and the good is coming. Glory and wealth are in the future. I have never seen medicine like this twice in my life. The Empress has nothing to say about you in the future." The old medical officer whispered by his ear. In his view, only now would Xin Xian start to wake up and have his own consciousness. Xin Xian's body was gradually cleaned. His flesh and blood started to regenerate. Even the pain was quickly suppressed by the cool medicinal power. Yet, what the old medical officer did not know was that when Xin Xian heard his words, the corners of his mouth curled up into a disdainful smile. Injuring a person to the extreme, even if the best spirit medicine is used as a sign of gratitude, even if the flesh and cultivation can be recovered, can everything really be recovered? Xin Xian sneered inside. At this time, his empty eyes were looking at the roof of the palace. Among the withered vines on the roof, the few surviving dark red vines had absorbed fresh nutrients and were especially tender and beautiful. One of them even sprouted a new bud. As he sneered inside, Huang Jinwei, dressed in light yellow robes, was on a turret looking silently at a section of the wall that was being built. The foundation of the wall started from the east. At the edge of Chongling, the foundation had been built for many miles. They were just waiting for the excavated rocks to be transported over. Chongling which originally had no walls, would quickly build a grand wall. Other than the turrets that stood like giants in Chongling, the height of this wall would surpass the height of all the other buildings in Chongling. On another turret in the distance, multiple generals were looking silently at Huang Jinwei. Chongling did not have walls in the past, and the guards on the turrets all had generals. While they had the highest general, in reality, the highest general listened to Mo Shoqing. In reality, Mo Shoqing was the highest commander of the Chongling guards. While the Martial Bureau had camps inside Chongling, and all the armies outside Chongling were under the command of the Martial Bureau, the city guards were still an important and powerful force. After Mo Shoqing's death, under the orders of the Empress, the city guards were naturally handed over to Huang Jinwei. Huang Jinwei was Mo Shoqing's student and usually studied with him. None of the generals of the city guards had any objections to him taking over Mo Shoqing's position. Yet what they found hard to understand was that Huang Jinwei had originally been a bureau chief. When the city walls were built and the city guards were handed over to him, Huang Jinwei's power naturally surpassed the other bureau chiefs and marquisate establishments. What they found even harder to understand was the new news coming out of the imperial palace today. The cruel official Xin Xian, who had been in charge of the great floating water prison, was going to become the secretariat director of the Qin dynasty. For ordinary middle and low-ranking officials, the words secretariat director might not mean much, but for these high-ranking officials who had experienced the changes of the past and the Bazinkindo ground, the words were too shocking. The world knew that the Qin dynasty had quickly grown strong because of the Bazinkindo ground. The Bazinkindo ground had pushed the Qin dynasty reform. But most people only knew that the ones in charge of the reform were the Shang family, and did not know that other than the Shang family, there was also the Li family. The Li family changed the law. The Shang family changed the ancestral law. The Li family's heavy punishment and some of their ideas surpassed imperial power. Even more importantly, the secretariat director was one of that person's ideas, and an official position above the bureaus. These high-ranking generals who guarded the city could not understand why the Empress would activate the secretariat decree again. But they were certain that if this news was true, then in the future, Chongling would have two more leaders who were close to, or even equal to the two prime ministers. One was Huang Jinwei, whom they were following right now. The other was Xin Xian, who had walked out of the great floating water prison, fighting in the north and south, hoping to be made a marquis. In the end, he is not as good as a cruel official who walked out of the torture room. One of the city guards shook his head with a cold smile. He said this because he thought of the Tiger Wolf Army General Liang Lian who had died. His mood right now was slightly discontent and represented the mood of most of the generals. What we think is not important. Another general next to him glanced at him and said with slight disdain, "I'm just curious about the Holy One's mood. What does the Holy One think about her actions?" Chapter 504. All of the city guards were silent and did not speak. Everyone in the world knew that Zheng Xiu was the most powerful mistress of the Qin dynasty. She could even be said to be the person in charge of Chongling right now. Everyone knew that after Yuan Wu ascended the throne, he spent most of his time in seclusion. Almost all political matters were left to the two ministers and Zheng Xiu to handle. Yet, all of the Qin people's attitudes towards Zheng Xiu were subtle. Her cold governance of the Qin dynasty caused the Qin dynasty to be unprecedentedly orderly and powerful in these years. Yet, her coldness always caused people to feel displeasure, just like her previous attitude towards Mo Shoqing. More importantly, she still had that person's mark on her. In the view of these guards, even if she betrayed that person in the end and chose Yuan Wu, she had once been that person's woman. For many years, the Holy One they were loyal to had chosen to forget and erase. Yet, some of the things she did caused people to think of that person again. The Holy One's intentions were unfathomable. Yet for these people who did not like Zheng Xiu, they knew that the strength of the Qin dynasty was due to the close relationship between the Holy One and the Empress. The Holy One's cultivation was strong, and the Empress' governance was peerless. for the enormous Qin dynasty. What was most important was the Holy One's attitude and thoughts towards the Empress' actions. Xian, Secretariat Director? In the authoritative and dark imperial palace, the Yuanwu Emperor sat on the couch in his cotton robes. He looked coolly at the scroll of documents in front of him, calmly shook his head, and then closed his eyes. Closing the eyes was the start of a new round of cultivation. The meaning was to not see. Towards everything Zheng Xiu did, he was still the same as before, allowing Zheng Xiu to do as she pleased and not see. The imperial palace was very quiet, but the people walking inside looked at the seclusion room the emperor used to cultivate, the ministers' pavilions, and the empress' study in the inner palace. They all felt great terror. They all felt that something major was about to happen. Yet nothing happened. Everything was as calm as usual. The table and chair that the empress sat on moved forward a little, closer to the mysterious courtyard and the spirit spring that was surrounded by white spirit energy. All the petals of the spirit lotus in the spirit spring had already withered, forming a tight lotus seed pod. The swirling white spirit chi seemed to be gathering towards the lotus seeds in the lotus seed pod. Every immature lotus seed was like an individual cultivator, exuding an indescribable spiritual aura. The empress' perfect face gave off a porcelain-like glow. Her gaze seemed to be cast calmly into the blurred light moving through the courtyard. But in the world of perception, it was a stormy sea. Her perception had already reached a high altitude in the starry sky that she normally couldn't reach. The life bond sword that came from the Zhao sword furnace and had been forcibly taken by her passed through the thinnest air with great difficulty. It seemed to have truly left the world, turned into a star, and slowly moved through the silent starry sky. Her perception entangled with this sword, striving to make this sword accept the refinement of the star fire that she could not touch in the past. This was a brand new exploration for her, and also a great risk. The small sword that carried her was like a little boat in the ocean, in danger of capsizing at any time. With each new thread of star fire that landed on the small sword, the energy on the small sword would give off a thread of smoke. The sword would tremble violently, and the pain would be transmitted back to her perception and affect her body. This life-bond sword of Zhao Si, after being refined day and night, almost became her life-bond sword. The pain of the life-bond sword was true pain. However, she did not feel the slightest bit of pain. This was because a great joy had always filled her entire body, her entire spiritual world. When each thread of energy on the small sword was burned and seemed to be in danger, starlight would be gathered from all directions by her will and enter the small sword. The starlight turned to energy and merged with the remaining star fire on the small sword, settling into the small sword. Occasionally, fragments would fall off the surface of the small sword, but the entire sword did not shrink. This small sword seemed to be reborn from the inside out. At this time, she also felt she was being reborn. She was a proud daughter of the heavens, but when she left Jiaodong Commandery, she encountered that person. No matter how good she was, she could not surpass that person. When that person disappeared, Yuanwu would pass realmate. No matter if it was in the past or now, she carried the mark of that person or Yuanwu, and felt she was always in their shadows. Now, she had the Zhao sword furnace sword that could endure her will and the refinement of the star fire. She also had the heaven-replenishing divine art to take her into a new world. Her mind was as free as when she first entered Chongling. When the small sword broke through the limits of her perception, and the surface peeled off like a cicada, welcoming new life, Xian, dressed in a new official robe, was slowly walking out of the cold palace. His official robe was a deep purple that Chongling had never seen before, and the patterns on his robe twisted like chains. The wounds on his body had formed scabs and fallen off, but his skin was still uneven, like there were many withered vines hidden under his skin. The new flesh was still itchy, but breathing in the fresh air, Xian inexplicably smiled. He welcomed his new life, Yin Xanadu. A rebellion started by an outer king had been completely quelled. Many troops from other counties had begun to withdraw, and the people began to busy themselves with their livelihoods. The people of Xanadu had seen too many bloody incidents like this. As long as it was not carried out in their own small courtyards, most of the major incidents would just become a topic of conversation after a meal. Corpses were still being cleaned out of the streets that had been most damaged in the battle. A general wearing bronze armor sat tiredly on a collapsed wall. He looked at the corpses of his subordinates that were being cleaned out. The bitterness and helplessness in his eyes grew thicker and thicker. Nearby, there were many patrolling Imperial Palace guards. When they looked at this mountainous general, their eyes were filled with admiration and awe. This general was the famous general of the Yin dynasty, Fan Yuchi, the general of the Yin North Army. The awe naturally came from the strength Fan Yuchi had shown in leading the army in this rebellion. The envy came from this rebellion had caused many generals above this general to die. This general seemed to have naturally risen in rank and would be the first person to reorganize the army. If a person wanted to become a king and a marquis, they needed some astounding encounters. However, for Fan Yuchi, he knew very well that the reason he was able to sit here alive in the end was because he had many fearless warriors under his command, and also because there were many powerful outsiders in the alley he was fighting in. The general raised his hand, and a subordinate with a grave and stern face, whose eyes were filled with grief, came to his side. "Give this to the outsider called Wang Taishu." He took out a commander's seal and handed it to his subordinate. He slowly said, "Tell him I owe him a favor." Chapter 505. A heavy snow covered the north of the Yin Mountain. The defeated Qin army retreated to the Yin Mountain and steadied themselves. As large numbers of cultivators and armies arrived, they started to counterattack. Yet as the Wuji army retreated into the plains, the Qin army was stopped in their tracks by the thick snow. Chongling had not frozen, but the temperature at the Wuji border was so cold that one's breath would turn to ice, and their scalps would go numb. Even cultivators could not avoid using vital energy to resist the cold. Ordinary soldiers might not even be able to keep their thoughts clear, much less travel long distances to fight. An astounding number of armies set up camps around the border cities. This was a great test of the warden's office's ability to transport and move food, and the consumption was astounding. At the distant Donghu and Qin dynasty borders, the temperature was even colder. Some saltwater lakes were frozen to the bottom. The wind that blew up pieces of ice and created a patch of white. This kind of wind was called the white hair wind. It caused needle-like pain when it blew on people's faces and blocked their vision. When the wind blew, it was easy for people to get lost. Occasionally, there would be lakes that were not frozen to the bottom. They were deep freshwater lakes. The water in the depths of the lakes was close to freezing, but not frozen. Large numbers of fish would gather there, as though they were hibernating. One of the elite border armies of the Qin army was stationed by a lake like this. They relied on fishing in the winter to solve their food problem. Multiple flying swords flew in and out of the ice, giving off terrifying vibrations. Large pieces of ice were cut open and then shattered into pieces by the powerful sword energies. Enormous winches were set up next to these cut ice caves. They used ropes to drag fishing nets in. The enormous fishing nets would be dragged under the ice for more than 2 hours. With each net, there would be thousands of caddies of fish. No one knows what she is thinking. If she started a war with Wuji just to force so many cultivators into the border army, then the price she paid is too great. So many armies are stationed at the Wuji border. Does she want to wait until spring to fight? She destroyed so many cultivation places and drained the pond to fish. We'll have to wait until at least the end of April before the snow melts outside the pass. In the next half a year, let's not talk about anything else. There are hundreds of thousands of extra mouths waiting to eat there. I don't believe that the food can be transported over. Most people of the Qin dynasty had a respectful and disgusted attitude towards Empress Zhengxiu, especially the border armies far away from Chongling. Their attitude towards this mistress of the Qin dynasty was even more direct and sharp. At this time, it was almost time for the fish to come out. It was a matter of food for the winter. Several Qin generals, wearing thick black cotton robes under their black armor, sat on the carriages. They did not look at the ice caves where the fish came out. Instead, they gathered together and discussed the latest military intelligence. What's there to not understand? A slightly immature voice that carried the coldness of the Arctic ice sounded from the side. Although the Great Qin has destroyed the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, most of the credit goes to the cultivation grounds. Some cities were paved with just a few swords, especially since the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties are closest to our dynasty. Even after so many years of war, the grain carriages of the Qin dynasty did not travel far. Just like doing business, when a shop opens, even if one product is selling well, it needs to be sold in small batches first. Then we will see if the goods and the workshops can keep up. In the words of our trade, it can be turned. If it can be turned and it goes smoothly, then we can slowly increase the quantity. Often, we need to do a few big deals before we can see if the workshops, workers, and shopkeepers can keep up with the bigger deals. If the Qin dynasty's army only goes to the border, and the warden's office cannot keep up, then when the Qin dynasty's army goes further into the Chu, Yin, and Qi, how can the transportation keep up? Zheng Xiu is not stupid. Fighting Wuji is just practice. If it goes smoothly, it will go smoothly against the Chu, Yin, and Qi. The generals sitting together were startled at first. Then they all raised their heads and looked at the young general who was commanding the carriages at the side. One of the generals picked up a wineskin that was still warm in his bosom and threw it over. He was the first to laugh and scold. Xie Changsheng, you actually compare war to business. However, this description is very apt and very reasonable. I think the Empress is really like this. You are right. How is she stupid? In terms of intelligence, all of us added together can't even compare to one of her fingers. The young general's face was young, but he had a disdainful expression. This Xie Changsheng was the famous Xie Changsheng of the Guanzhong Xie family in Chongling. Xie Changsheng raised an eyebrow, opened the wine bag, and took a drink. He said, "This wine is too bad. I'll get some good wine in the spring." If there was no war at the Donghu border, there would be few people for hundreds of miles. Fish and meat were easy to get, but wine was rare. In the military, this strong wine was the greatest reward a high-level general could give to their subordinates. Hearing Xie Changsheng say that the wine was not good, these generals stilled and then could not help but laugh. At this moment, the white hair on the surface of the lake suddenly stirred, as if there was a different sound of wind. The general's breathing immediately stopped, but in the next moment, there were several short whistles. The general's expressions relaxed slightly, but they were puzzled. Looking in the direction of the sound, the vital energy of these generals flowed, and their eyesight increased greatly. 3 figures slowly appeared in the white wind. The 2 at the front were hunched over by the thick white fur blanket they wore. Behind them was a slender figure who seemed to be wearing an ordinary fur robe. Do not worry, it is also someone from Guangzhou. Xie Changsheng's cultivation was naturally not as good as these generals, but he only saw the general appearance of the slender figure. He sneered and said, "Guangzhou?" The generals gradually saw that the slender figure was a young man about the same age as Xie Changsheng. They were even more confused. However, when the young man came closer, they felt a chill in their hearts. They felt that the sword intent this young man cultivated was somewhat extraordinary. Originally, Ding Ning was the last disciple of White Goat Cave, but he forced his way in and became Shui Wangshu's last student. Xie Changsheng adjusted his collar, threw the wine bag back, and said, "Shani." These generals immediately reacted. "Xie Changsheng, you are here as expected. Searching for someone in this kind of weather. You think you are a Realm 7 cultivator? You are not afraid of being frozen into ice." When the 2 young people met, one was overjoyed, the other sneered. Seeing Xie Changsheng's attitude, Chinese suddenly became sluggish. "What are you doing here?" Xie Changsheng turned his head and did not look at him, only at where the fish had come out. White energy shrouded the ice caves where the nets were, and there was the sound of large fish splashing through the water. Shini froze for a moment and said in a trembling voice, "Senior sect brother Ding Ning, If you have come just to tell me that your senior sect brother died in battle at the Mountain of Ancestors, then I can only say that you are too stupid. Xie Chongqing's expression darkened, and he interrupted him. Since I can come to the Donghu border army, do you think I do not know what is happening outside? Chunyi raised his head. His eyes seemed to be a little red from the wind, but he stubbornly looked at Xie Chongqing and said, I didn't come here to tell you this. I just have a few words to say to you alone. Xie Chongqing frowned, but did not say anything. He only nodded at the generals and walked downwind. It wasn't until he was surrounded by a vast expanse of whiteness and the cold wind whistled past his ears that he turned around and stopped, looking at Chunyi and saying, Speak. Can you not hate the Empress? Chunyi looked at him and said seriously. Xie Chongqing's frown deepened. What idiotic things are you saying? Your actions do not just represent yourself, but will drag down the entire Xie family. Chunyi looked at him and said slowly, If my senior sect brother wants to kill the Empress, and even the Holy One, what will you do? He is dead, and you are telling me if... Xie Chongqing laughed coldly, very loudly. He did not care if others heard because his words did not need to be kept secret. Because my senior sect brother also asked me this. Chunyi looked at him and said softly, He also told me, if news of his death spread, do not believe it. Xie Chongqing was stunned. You have to answer my question first, then I'll tell you the rest. Chunyi looked at him and said, Is this not an idiotic question? Xie Chongqing breathed with difficulty and controlled his voice. Helping those close to me and not reason, this is me, Xie Chongqing. I do not care about the Holy One, the Empress, or the Qin dynasty. You did not listen to the arrangements and ran early to the Donghu border to wait for my senior sect brother. My senior sect brother was forced to go to Donghu and did not come here. But before my senior sect brother left, he gave me a letter and told me about this matter. Chunyi's eyes became even redder. He knew that you wouldn't listen to anyone and would only help those close to you. If something happened to him, you would definitely make trouble for him. He didn't treat you as one of his own, but you already treated him as one of your own. So, he asked me to give you his money pouch and also told me to pass on a message to you. Since you're the best at spending money, you should spend all the money in his pouch. Chapter 506. Most young people in Chongling knew that Xie Chongqing of the Xie family was the best at spending money. In order to control him, the Xie family put Xie Rou in charge of supervising him. In terms of spending money, if Xie Chongqing said he was second, no one would dare to say they were first. In this bone-chilling white-hair wind, Xie Chongqing grew silent. He thought of the first time he saw Ding Ning. At that time, he had been spending money recklessly. If it is said he is dead, do not believe it. Want me to spend all the money in his money pouch? How much money could a wine shop youth have? Xie Chongqing narrowed his eyes and slowly raised his head. He looked at Shun Yi, who was holding a money pouch. He did not reach out to take it. Truthfully, he really left these words, and my father did not have you come? He purposely used me to spend money to forget that he is dead? Old wind means an old friend in the wind is coming. Chunyi looked at Xie Zhongxing and inexplicably said something that didn't seem to make sense. Xie Chongqing stilled, and his body started to tremble indiscernibly. In the last communication with him, Ding Ning had left the words old wind. He had never understood it. But now, Shun Yi was standing in the wind, looking at him and telling him the meaning of Ding Ning's words. Shun Yi looked at him and said, Senior sect brother had me tell you these words. Previously, I did not understand the meaning at all. But today, I am here to see you. Did senior sect brother predict that I would come to see you at this time before he left Chongling? No one could truly see the secrets of the heavens. The only possibility was that he predicted he would not be able to resist coming to the Donghu border. As to the old friend in the wind coming at the Donghu border, once winter came, the white-hair wind would not stop. This was not a heavenly secret. If Ding Ning had planned this, then what was in this money pouch? Xie Chongqing did not speak. He reached out to take the money pouch in Xun Yi's hand and opened it. There weren't any real coins in the pouch, nor were there any pearls or gems that were equivalent to coins. There were only some very old jade slips, cowhide, silk paper, and other things. They were all stamped with a unique seal or sealed with lacquer or lead. When Xie Chongqing saw a few of the items, he gasped for breath violently. Because the temperature in the white hair wind was too low, the intense inhalation caused him to cough violently, causing his face to distort. These things were worthless to most people because most people didn't even know what they were. Yet as the only son of the wealthiest Xie family in Guangzhou, he knew this was proof. Banks and gambling houses were some of the oldest businesses. Many private banks and gambling houses were not famous, but they were very old and kept a large amount of wealth in secret. This was especially true for some private banks. They didn't have any amazing wealth themselves and only kept some things for others. In order to keep it strictly confidential, even they themselves didn't know what kind of treasures were stored in their own warehouses. Because of his business dealings, Xie Chongqing knew almost all the public and underground banks. But there were some banks that even the Xie family had never worked with before. It was not that those banks were not good enough, but because those banks did not accept ordinary business. Only when the amount of wealth reached a certain level and the annual payment was astounding would those banks manage and keep it for them. In other words, while the Xie family was wealthy, they could not afford this kind of price. So even without the phrase, "an old friend in the wind has come," just by looking at the things inside, he was certain that this was not something that his father had thought of to appease him. Every piece of proof in this money pouch represented astounding wealth. The wealth inside might be even more astounding than the entire Xie family. Xie Chongqing coughed violently and put the cold money pouch against his chest. During this process, his movements were slow and he did not speak, but his mind was in turmoil. When the reform was completed and the Yuanwu emperor ascended the throne, no merchant could accumulate such astounding wealth. Only the old aristocratic families before the reform possessed wealth that was even more astonishing than the treasury of a dynasty. Moreover, those old aristocratic families were the best at dividing and hiding wealth. So this could only come from the old nobility. Chongling's old nobility? So you were never an ordinary person. Xie Chongqing felt the coldness from the money pouch on his skin and shook his head in self-mockery. He thought slowly inside. Then he raised his head and stared at Chun Yi with a cold expression, seriously asking, "Not only me, but your Chun family is also not small. The question you asked me before, I'd like to hear how you answer it." The extreme cold made people's thoughts slow. Chun Yi stilled for a moment before remembering what the question was. He said, "Before senior sect brother left, he had Yi Jingnan ask me the same question. My answer is that if I am senior sect brother for a day, I will be senior sect brother for life, regardless of him or Zhang Yi. If you are senior sect brother for a day, you will be senior sect brother for life. Like me, you help your family and not reason?" Xie Chongqing smiled scornfully and said, "You really do not fear being a burden to your father. The adults will naturally make their own choices. If they don't agree with what I'm doing, my family will sever all ties with me long before I do anything." Chun Yi looked at him and said, "So I only need to consider my own thoughts." Xie Chongqing's scornful smile completely disappeared. He looked at Shin Yi for a long time in the wind and then bowed to Shin Yi. He said, "I always thought that you were useless, or at least mediocre. Adding on that you like my sister, I thought you were not worthy of my sister. A toad wanted to eat swan meat, so I always found you irritating. But today, I know you are not useless and have areas worthy of respect. No wonder Shui wanted to take you as his last disciple. Now that I think about it, I was stupid. If I had known, I do not know if he would have accepted you as his disciple." Chun Yi subconsciously hurriedly returned the greeting, but when he thought of Shui Wangshu, Ding Ning, and Zhang Yi, he inexplicably choked up, unable to speak. "I do not know what you think." Xie Chongqing straightened his clothes and tightened his collar with a black scarf. Then he slowly said, "No matter how certain others are, I didn't believe that he was dead. Especially after hearing about his arrangements, I don't think he is dead." Shin Yi's heart inexplicably warmed, but his eyes were still dim. "The fish is about to come out. What a coincidence. You can make it to a big feast." Xie Chongqing turned his head. The wind in front of him made him narrow his eyes. He was best at spending money, and he had never felt that spending money like flowing water was wrong. But to spend such an astonishing sum of money, how to spend it was a problem. If even Zheng Xiu thinks you are dead, but you're not dead, then where did you go? He slowly said in his heart. You were never an ordinary person. Everyone in the world thought you were dead, but no one thought you were here with me. In a spacious tent, an old woman who was meticulously boiling butter tea raised her head and looked at the young man who was quietly sitting across from her, waiting for his tea to be served. The furnishings of this tent were very simple. It would appear very ordinary if placed alone in the wilderness. Yet outside this tent, in the cold wind and snow, there were countless tents. Her tent was the center of the countless tents outside. This old woman was the Empress Dowager of Wuji, the true ruler of Wuji. The sword manual of the Mountain of Ancestors and your arrival show your sincerity. But Ding Ning, why are you not worried that I will kill you? The old woman smiled kindly and poured a cup of hot tea into the bowl of the young person opposite her. The young person sitting across from her was Ding Ning. What made you feel that I would agree to these conditions, and that I would cooperate with you to act, especially after you did not conceal your identity as the heir to the nine-death silkworm? Before Ding Ning spoke, she added, because of some past events. Ding Ning picked up the slightly salty and bitter hot tea, slowly drinking it as he answered seriously. Past events? The old woman stilled slightly. Chapter 507. The Qin dynasty is strong because of the reform. Even the lowest born, if they are brave enough, can accumulate merit in exchange for land. It is not so simple to become a king or marquis, but it is not so difficult to have some land in Chongling and a place to live. Ding Ning looked at the slightly murky tea and said calmly, in a certain sense, this reform gives everyone in the Qin dynasty an equal chance. For all those of low birth, this is hope. The old woman nodded and listened intently. She had enough patience and knew that Ding Ning would not waste words for no reason. So for many Qin people, it is not important who is the emperor. What is important is whether they have good days, whether they are proud as Qin people, and who can maintain such hope. So there are not many Qin people who want to kill that person. Ding Ning smiled self-deprecatingly and said, in the end, even though Yuanwu and Zheng Xiu promised great benefits, and Realm 7 cultivators gathered in Chongling to kill him, most of the Qin people were old nobles who were dissatisfied with that person and the Bazinkindo ground. Most of them were cultivators from other dynasties and countries. The old woman shook her head and sighed emotionally. That person probably did not expect that after fighting for the Qin dynasty for his entire life, in the end, it was in the Qin dynasty that countless cultivators from enemy dynasties came to kill him. Because that person was too strong. In the eyes of all the enemies of the Qin dynasty, he was the greatest threat. So at the time, Wuji's Realm 7s came out in full force. Ding Ning finished the tea in his hand and looked up at the old woman. He said calmly, at the time, the strongest cultivators of Wuji entered Chongling under your orders and died in Chongling. In terms of losses, Wuji lost more than a dozen peerless experts. I fear they were the greatest losses of all the dynasties back then. The old woman was slightly surprised and her eyes widened slightly. I had not expected you to know these old matters. But since you are the heir to the nine-death silkworm, since I did my best to have him die, the hatred between me and the Bazinkindo ground cannot be resolved. You still dare to come see me? Acting according to the situation back then was that everyone in the world wanted him dead. If this hatred could not be resolved, then would the Bazinkindo ground kill everyone in the world for revenge? Ding Ning took a deep breath and said slowly, he chose to enter Chongling and knew he was going to die. This hatred started because of Yuanwu and Zheng Xiu, so they should end it. It is good that you can think this way. The old woman looked into his eyes and said sincerely, if Yuanwu and Zheng Xiu had not created such a chance for the people of the world, who in the world could have killed him? After a pause, the old woman smiled self-deprecatingly and said, but if we really talk about hatred, so many people died for him. How can it be settled clearly? Back then, everyone in the world knew that Zheng Xiu wanted to use the dynasties to kill him. But everyone also knew that if that person did not die and killed Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiu, and that person won, the Qin dynasty would be even more terrifying. With that person's talent and abilities, I fear that not just Wu Ji, but even Chu, Yin, and Qi would have been destroyed. The Qin dynasty has already unified the world, so the dynasties were willing to be used by Zheng Xiu. When she spoke to this point, the old woman paused again and revealed a bitter smile, as if it was difficult for her to speak. Those cultivators who I thought were unusually strong back then could not even block one blow from him. Wherever his sword passed, it would be defeated with one blow, and those who faced him would be killed with one blow. But those grandmasters, those experts, in order to use up his vital energy, still went to their deaths, and the corpses piled up into mountains. So many grandmasters of my dynasty that even I found stunning were killed with one blow, like ordinary soldiers in front of him. Every time I mention this old matter, I still feel cold inside. Ding Ning maintained his silence and did not speak. The old woman sighed emotionally. Every time I think of this old matter, I also feel respect for that person. But he had to die back then because it was his fault that gave the people of the world a chance to kill him. Ding Ning said coolly, just like his tone with Zhang Sun Qinxue in the wine shop. But the general trend is that Yuan Wu must die. This is why I dared to come see you. Mister, your arrival itself represents the greatest sincerity. So I am willing to pay a certain price to cooperate and have the world think that you are dead. The old woman suddenly nodded to Ding Ning, and even her address became respectful. It is so pleasant to talk with Mister. I want to hear more of Mister's opinions. Before ascending the throne, Yuan Wu seemed to give everyone the feeling that he was the most mediocre of that group. Ding Ning looked at her and said, but everyone was wrong. To be able to arrange and complete so many things in secret, such as destroying the Bazinkindo ground, this is enough to show his ambition. Even if he pretends to be mediocre now, it means that he has greater ambition. Even more importantly, his cultivation speed is not fast, but he has reached Realm 8. The old woman who was listening was shocked and said, Mister, you mean that Yuan Wu may reach Realm 9? He does not need to reach Realm 9, even if he is just one step closer to Realm 9. Ding Ning laughed disdainfully. The Qin dynasty's fleet has been searching for spirit medicines overseas. If there are some that can make his vitality stronger and his vital energy stronger, no one in the world will be able to kill him. You should know that he is the emperor of the Qin dynasty now. If he really reaches that step, the cultivators of the other dynasties will not be able to safely enter Chongling or the center of the Qin dynasty's army. Countless cultivators will safely come to his side and gather to kill him. The old woman was silent for a moment and thought seriously. Then she said, in the future, will the Bazinkindo ground promise Wu Ji? Ding Ning looked at her and said, the Bazinkindo ground has never broken its promises and never betrayed its friends. As long as Wu Ji is in the hands of our friends, we will be at ease. The old woman said with slight difficulty, Wu Lianzi is too young. You can teach him. You have a long time to teach him. Ding Ning bowed seriously to her. When she raised her head again, he had already reached out and grabbed her wrist. The old woman stilled slightly, but did not refuse or stop him. She realized something when she heard the countless tiny noises. Her body trembled. The illnesses in her body that could affect her life and death, especially the area that even the best doctors in the world could not treat, were disintegrated by the small things and disappeared. A youthful vitality returned to her body. Chapter 508. Donghu has been very ambiguous these years. Even in the previous war, Donghu was not determined to send troops. Ding Ning said slowly with a calm expression. The old woman took a deep breath and nodded. She said, the emperor is trash. Hearing such a simple comment, Ding Ning could not help but laugh. Then he immediately became serious. Back then, many people from Donghu went to Chongling. In the end, one person survived. The old woman stilled slightly. Ding Ning took back his hand, took out a piece of wood from his sleeve, and handed it to the old woman. "Give this to that person. He will have the Donghu Emperor listen to some of our suggestions." There were some faint sword marks on the ordinary piece of pine wood, but there was a certain meaning flowing between these simple sword marks that caused the old woman to feel pain in her eyes. "Mr. is so strong. You really have the style of your teacher." She stilled for a moment and looked up at Ding Ning. "Happy birthday." Ding Ning reached out to pour himself a cup of butter tea, bowed slightly, and said, "Thank you, mister, for your blessing." The old woman smiled emotionally and returned the bow. The night wind suddenly turned cold. Su Qin started to cough. He looked at the stone steps in front of him, and then at the room high up. He laughed self-mockingly. This was Celestial Seal Sect. For the rebellion that had swept through the entire dynasty, Celestial Seal Sect had been the center of the whirlpool. Yet after the rebellion, Celestial Seal Sect was the calmest and had suffered the least losses. Even those people who had participated in the rebellion expressed opinions different from the sect master, and even tried to trap the sect master on the mountain. The sect master of Celestial Seal Sect did not pursue them, as though nothing had happened. Just as he was laughing emotionally and self-mockingly, clear footsteps sounded behind him. He turned around. A Celestial Seal Sect teacher's footsteps were dotted with stars, as though he was walking on starlight. "You have come to kill me?" Su Qin's face paled slightly, and his self-deprecating expression deepened. "Did Zheng Xiu send you to kill me?" This Celestial Seal Sect teacher smiled scornfully and said, "Just now, you were looking at the mountain. You must be sighing at the spirit of important people. How can someone like you guess the thoughts of these important people?" Su Qin also smiled and said, "It's best that they're not here to kill me. When I look at the mountain, I'm not sighing at the spirit of the great figures. Instead, I'm thinking about when I can become such a great figure." This Celestial Seal Sect teacher smiled until his eyes narrowed. "Those who are too ambitious will easily die early." Su Qin smiled and said, "But I'm not dead yet. The Empress is very dissatisfied with you for killing Zhang Yi, but she is satisfied with your performance so far." This Celestial Seal Sect teacher put away his smile and looked up coldly. "So she gave you a chance?" After saying this, he took out a yellow cloth bag from his bosom and handed it to Su Qin. Su Qin's eyes flashed with an unusual light. Yet when his hands touched the yellow cloth bag, a powerful force charged into his heart and lungs. With a pop, a mouthful of blood shot out of his mouth. Starlight flashed. Only the back of the Celestial Seal Sect teacher remained. His disdainful voice continued to come from the mountain path. "While she gave you a chance, and I cannot go against her will to kill you, you dare to speak to me with such an attitude. I can easily teach you a lesson like teaching a dog, adding injury to injury." Su Qin started to cough violently, spitting out purple-black blood clots. He knew these people did not care what he could accomplish, and only cared about Zheng Xiu's order to let him live. But he still struggled to look up at the Celestial Seal Sect teacher and said, "I know you. I know your name is Han Xinghe." The Celestial Seal Sect teacher, who was leaving, raised an eyebrow. He naturally understood that Su Qin meant revenge in the future. But in his eyes, Su Qin was no different from a dog right now. So he smiled even more scornfully and did not speak. The starlight faded and the sun rose. A carriage drove out of an official residence close to the Chongling Imperial Palace towards the east of Chongling. The carriage was not fast, but as it moved towards the rising sun, it seemed to melt into the golden sunlight and step into the rising sun. The one-armed official sitting expressionlessly in the carriage was Shen Xian. Usually, the officials of Chongling, and even the generals, feared two people the most. One was Chief Inspector Chun of the Divinity Bureau, and the other was Bureau Chief Yi of the Astrology Bureau. But now, this former prison official was above the two of them, and became the most feared existence of Chongling's officials. Shen Xian narrowed his eyes. His expression was like a cat, as though he was enjoying the warm light. After traveling under the rising sun for a long time, the carriage finally turned around and arrived in front of a small courtyard. There was no rain, but multiple black umbrellas were open, blocking the sunlight and the faces of the cultivators under the umbrellas. They blocked his carriage. Xian patted the window for the carriage to stop. Then he said, "I want to see Bureau Chief Yi. This is Bureau Chief Ye's private residence. She does not receive guests." A very rude voice came from under the black umbrella. Xian was expressionless as he repeated, "I want to see Bureau Chief Yi." The voice under the black umbrella clearly contained a sneer. "But Bureau Chief Yi does not want to see you." Xian said, "You should know my present status. In Chongling, I have the right to see anyone at any time. If you stop me again, do you believe that I will kill you?" There was no response from under the black umbrellas because a voice sounded from the small courtyard behind. "You want to see me so much, you really dare to do this. You think I do not dare to kill you?" This voice was domineering and unreasonable. Yet in Chongling, Yi Siling did not seem to be reasonable. Xian stood and walked off the carriage. His gaze passed through the gaps between the murderous black umbrellas in front of him to look at the tightly closed door. He bowed slightly and said, "Because there are too many people in Chongling who want to kill me, I have come to see Bureau Chief Yi." Yi Siling's voice sounded with slight scorn. "Pity that I also want to kill you. After today, you will change your mind," Xian said. The courtyard was silent. The black umbrellas understood her meaning and opened up a path for her. Xian pushed open the half-closed door and walked around the screen wall. He saw a woman in a white dress who did not seem to fit in with the gray and black of Chongling. Yi Siling had his hands behind his back. While he was much shorter than Xian, he gave off a stronger presence than Xian. "The Empress wants me to live, but many people on the Holy One's side do not want me to live. So you must ensure that I do not die." Xian looked at him and said. Yi Siling glanced at him and said, "Tell me." It was just a simple sentence, but the air was suddenly filled with countless real, murderous intents. "Someone from the Mountain of Ancestors asked me to bring back some things for you," Xian said softly. Xian said softly and then closed his eyes. This small courtyard was surrounded by water canals and was filled with water vapor. When he closed his eyes, even more water vapor suddenly appeared at the same height as his body. There was a kind of boundless wind and rain aura forming. Yi Siling's pupils contracted. "This sword manual is very compatible with your one sky water. After giving it to you, your cultivation will reach great completion." Xian opened his eyes and looked at her. He said, "Also, you should know that I cannot comprehend such a sword essence so quickly." Yi Siling frowned and said, "So he is not dead?" Xian nodded. "So you have to ensure that I do not die." Yi Siling was silent for a moment and then suddenly laughed. He said, "I had not thought that I would stand with someone like you." Xian said sincerely, "I also did not expect this." Chapter 509. Heavy Snow. An army was silently waiting in the plains. Because the snow was exceptionally large, it appeared heavy. When the snow landed on the armor, there were even popping sounds like arrows landing on leather drums. The commander at the front held 2 golden chains. At the end of the chains were 2 snow apes that were twice as tall as ordinary soldiers. When they smelled the familiar presence in the wind and snow, the 2 snow apes growled at the same time. "General Yalu, the wind and snow is too heavy. Why don't we not travel and come to my tent to drink a pot of hot wine?" The leader's armor was also pure gold, which seemed out of place in this world. Because the surroundings were too pale and cold, the pure gold armor on his body was even more dazzling. The beams of light were like burning golden sunlight, and in the end, what was reflected in people's eyes was like a rolling orange flame. He wore a mask made of pure gold on his face, and there were several unique runes that looked like tear marks, with sparkling and translucent spots of light flowing within them. At this time, his voice passed through the wind and snow and caused all the snow ahead to boil like a pot of porridge. "There is no need to be so polite." A faint but unimaginably majestic voice came out of the wind and snow. The boiling snow suddenly calmed and fell to the ground like heavy lead. Only one person walked over. But the sound of the snow falling to the ground was like an army following. I am not being polite. The deposed crown prince of Donghu, the general of Wuji. At this time, the war between Wuji and the Qin dynasty has not completely stopped. He is not leading troops in Wuji, but has come to Donghu for a walk in the wind and snow. How can I not entertain him as a host? This Donghu commander looked at the man walking slowly in white fox fur and said, I hope that General Yelu Songlong will sympathize with us and move to rest early, and not have us accompany you for a walk. The man in the white fox fur coat was the top person of the Wuji military, Yelu Songlong. His expression was calm as he looked at the enormous army and the vast world behind the army. His eyes held an indescribable sigh, but his tone was still cold and indifferent. The Donghu emperor has no other use, but he is good at making crown princes. He made 5 crown princes in a row, but was not satisfied and abolished them all. The other countries only have the first prince, second prince, and third prince. Donghu has the first crown prince, second crown prince, and third crown prince. The Donghu general's tone suddenly turned harsh. General Yelu, you fled to Wuji and became the Wuji general. My emperor did not pursue this matter, and still allied with Donghu because of the blood ties. What? You want to discuss old debts today? No need to be nervous. I just came to deliver a letter. Yelu Songlong looked at the Donghu general and smiled faintly. The Donghu general shook his head and said coldly, Pity, no matter who you want to send the letter to, I will not let you pass. I know. Yelu Songlong looked up slightly and smiled. I know you will follow me, so the person who sent the letter should have already delivered the letter to that person. The Donghu general's body suddenly shook, and the golden light on his body danced in the air like golden chains. He suddenly turned around and looked behind him. In the endless snowstorm, there seemed to be an enormous and vast shadow at the end of the world. That was a mountain. In the legends of the Donghu people, they thought it was the Gangboki divine mountain where the gods lived. What do you want to do? The Donghu general slowly turned around stiffly. He looked at Yelu Songlong and said slowly, Who do you want to send the letter to? Yelu Songlong looked at him and did not answer. Not because he did not like this general, but because there was no meaning in answering. Even he was not familiar with that person and did not understand. There were naturally cross-shaped stairs on the enormous mountain. Every stone step that was several feet tall was covered in ice and snow that would never melt. The meridians that looked like blue and black gems carried an ancient and strange power. Not just the air, even the primal energies of the universe became thin at such a height. At the bottom of the divine mountain, near the grasslands that ordinary herders could feed, there were some stone caves where many true ascetic monks lived. These monks sought to reduce their demands on the world as much as possible, to reduce their intake of food, and to pursue peace and joy in the mental world. In the winter, when the snowstorm came, even these true ascetic monks left these caves. But in a stone cave halfway up the mountain, there was still one ascetic. This stone cave was not deep. In the middle of summer, the sunlight could reach the end of the stone cave. On the stone walls on both sides, there were several venerables whose faces could not be seen clearly. Their faces were originally somewhat ferocious, but because they had been carved for an unknown period of time, the feeling of time intertwined with each other. In the dim environment, there was a kind of benevolence. At the end of the stone cave, there were some deep purple cotton mats covered in frost. An extremely thin old monk was sitting on top of them. The old monk's skin seemed to be tanned leather that clung tightly to his bones. But when he opened his eyes, they were glowing with true 5-colored light. A young person with a sword on his back appeared at the entrance of this stone cave. As he opened his eyes, his figure was reflected in his pupils. Sensing the unique sword scent of that city, the old monk felt this was a fated meeting. He spoke, his vocal cords vibrating for the first time after not vibrating for many years. He said in a gentle voice, "You are from Chongling?" The young person bowed and said, "This junior is Li Shixing from Chongling. I am from the Qin. Elder, an old friend of yours asked me to bring you something." "Old friend?" The old monk looked in puzzlement at the young person and asked him motionlessly, "What?" Li Shixing stood up. A piece of wood flew out of his hand and landed in front of the old monk. When this piece of wood flew through the air, the old monk's eyes shone brightly. The statues of the venerables on the two walls gave off strange sounds. Spirit energy formed in the thin air and sprayed out of the cave like a fountain. There was an inexplicable sound of metal clashing. The old monk stood up. The moment he stood up, the piece of wood stopped in front of him, after which it turned into powder and disappeared as he breathed. However, the lines on the piece of wood still existed in his eyes. "So this is the case." The old monk smiled and bowed to Li Shixing. He said with a smile, "What else did he say to me?" "He hopes that Donghu and Wuji will be on good terms," Li Shixing said. The old monk thought about it and said with true joy, "All right. Anything else?" "No." "Good." When he said the second good, the old monk's figure disappeared from the stone cave. A vast and empty presence passed through Li Shixing's body and suddenly went far away. Li Shixing had seen countless powerhouses, especially powerhouses like Gu Huai. However, this kind of aura still made his breathing stop. On top of a small mountain, there were buildings in yellow, white, and crimson colors. These vast buildings that pressed down on the mountain were the Donghu Imperial Palace. In many of the lower buildings of the Imperial Palace, there were countless serfs wailing under the whips, and many female slaves crying under the fat bodies of their masters. Donghu was different from the other dynasties of the world. Other than the nobility, the rest were all slaves. There were soldiers with golden spears patrolling outside the Imperial Palace. A barefoot old monk appeared without warning on the main mountain path of the Imperial Palace. "Who are you?" A general blocking the mountain path asked cautiously when he sensed the powerful aura of the old monk. "I want to see Yalu Jinying." Yalu Jinying was the Donghu Emperor. The general wanted to ask more questions, but the monk didn't stop walking. The general shouted and could not help but attack. Golden flows immediately flowed on the mountain path. Countless soldiers flooded in from all directions of the Imperial Palace. A wooden staff appeared in the old monk's hand. The wooden staff was black, like a burnt poker. When the wooden staff appeared, his footsteps slowed down. All of the terrifying aura on his body disappeared. It was as if he was an ordinary monk who didn't know how to cultivate it all. But the terrifying presence was gathered in the wooden staff in his hand. He simply reached out with the wooden staff without any finesse and hit the people or weapons close to him. None of his attacks missed, and no one could withstand one of his attacks. No matter if it was a Realm 3 or 4 low-level cultivator, or even multiple Realm 7 generals, there was no difference in front of his wooden staff. With just one strike, their flesh and blood flew, and they died. "Who are you?" No one could stop this old monk's attack. This old monk passed straight into the Imperial Palace and appeared in front of the Donghu Emperor. Amidst the Donghu Emperor's terrified voice, the old monk simply reached out with the wooden staff and knocked on the Donghu Emperor's head. With a pop, the Donghu Emperor's head exploded like a paper lantern. The entire Donghu Imperial Palace was deathly silent, like the wind and snow had stopped. The old monk turned and walked straight down the mountain path he had come from. The sword essence on the wooden seal reminded him that the true meaning he lacked the most in his cultivation was directness. If he could cross the river barefoot, why would he need to step on a floating reed? Since no one in the Donghu Imperial Palace could stop him today, he naturally had to use the most direct method. If he killed the Donghu Emperor like this, the people of the Donghu Imperial Palace would slowly learn of his identity and that he was the strongest cultivator in Donghu. Be on good terms with Wuji. When he walked out of the Imperial Palace, he turned slightly and said to the people in the Imperial Palace, Chapter 510. There would not be many Realm 7 cultivators in any Imperial Palace. There were too many Realm 7 Grandmasters, and they were a great threat to the safety of the Emperor in the Imperial Palace. But there would be many Realm 7 cultivators and cultivators below Realm 7 in the Imperial Palace. Many cultivators cultivated their entire lives in the imperial palace. Their cultivation levels were high, but the outside world did not know of their existence. Based on the experiences of the dynasties, a certain number of cultivators was enough to stop the assassinations of foreign enemies and delay enough time for the army to arrive. In the Donghu imperial palace built against the mountain, based on the experiences of the dynasties, the cultivators of a sect called Vajrayana would receive great treatment only second to the emperor, and receive any cultivation needs that Donghu could give. The value of their existence was to protect the imperial palace, and to assassinate the leaders of the rebels in Donghu. No one in Donghu could imagine that there was a cultivator who could kill his way into the imperial palace without any disguise to the emperor and then kill the emperor before leaving the imperial palace. That is the ascetic cultivator from the divine mountain. A monk wearing a dark purple robe and a golden crown looked at the old monk who was leaving with a wooden staff in his hand. He was so shocked that he could not be any more shocked. He had arrived at the last moment. Most cultivators in the imperial palace could not sense when he had arrived. But when he saw the wooden staff the old monk held out, he knew he could not stop this old monk. He is the legendary sect uncle of my sect. When the monk spoke, an ascetic cultivator in ragged robes came next to him. Looking at the back of the old monk, he nodded slowly. Then he raised a hand and bowed respectfully to the old monk. He said, when he went to Chongling in the past, his cultivation was hard to estimate, but he was not so terrifying. I had thought that he had returned seriously injured and would spend the rest of his life in the Divine Mountain. I had not expected his cultivation to increase greatly. Dharmaraja, great son Dharmaraja, Ananda Dharmaraja. When the monk and ascetic cultivator appeared, many respectful voices sounded in the imperial palace. Most people knelt on the ground to show their piety. When the Donghu emperor died, this monk and ascetic cultivator became the highest-ranking person in the imperial palace. Why did he do that? The monk with the golden crown looked at the spot where the old monk had disappeared, his lips trembling slightly. You don't have to understand why he did it. The key is that he did it. The cultivator in ragged robes sighed. He has not reached realm 8 and cannot fight a country alone. But he can do something like this because he has absolute confidence, and because Donghu has countless cultivators willing to die for Donghu, but not many willing to die for Yilu Jinying. The monk with the golden crown remembered that he had stopped attacking at the last moment. After a moment of silence, he turned his head and looked at the ascetic seriously. Ananda, what do you think we should do? The ascetic said without hesitation. He said we should be on good terms with Wuji, so we will be on good terms with Wuji. The monk with the golden crown thought and said, Yilu Songlong is a general in Wuji. Have him return. The ascetic cultivator nodded. All right. The monk with the golden crown relaxed slightly. He looked at the mountain path that was littered with corpses and blood. His eyes were filled with reluctance, but at the same time, he sighed. In his heart, he admired the old monk even more. He had to admit that in order to achieve such a goal, such a direct method had resulted in the least number of deaths. When the monk and the ascetic cultivator reached an agreement and looked in relief where the old monk had disappeared, Ding Ning was sitting in the Wuji Empress Dowager's tent, watching the wind and snow fall like lead. If there are no accidents, Donghu will quickly ally with Wuji, he said slowly to the old woman sitting on the thick blanket behind him. What restricts Wuji the most is rations and seal weapons. The old woman stilled and grimaced. She said, Sir must have discovered that we have been restricting rations in recent days. There is no need to save rations. Ding Ning shook his head and said, saving rations will lower morale and confidence in victory, especially after many people died in this battle and moved here. After the snow melts, rations and seal weapons will not be a problem. Sir is speaking of Donghu? The old woman did not understand. Even if Donghu's situation was as they had thought, Donghu did not have enough rations. Even more importantly, Ding Ning mentioned seal weapons. Other than some meteorites, Wuji had few mines that could make seal weapons. Donghu was the same, even if they had obtained some seal weapons from the Qin army in the previous battles. Most of them had been thrown away during the retreat. Naturally, They could not obtain enough seal weapons to equip the army through war. Normal methods, other than mines, had to have the method to make seal weapons, and cultivators and craftsmen who knew how to make seal weapons. After this winter, after the snow melts next spring, Chu will open border trade with you and Donghu. Ding Ning looked at the old woman and said calmly. The old woman sank into an indescribable shock. She was so shocked, she could not speak. Most of the rations will not come from Donghu, but will be delivered to Wuji for free. Ding Ning looked at the shocked woman and said, Chu will provide some mines to make seal weapons and craftsmen. The old woman finally focused and thought for a moment. She said, but Chu's situation is not stable. With such great fanfare, I fear that even Consort Zhao will not be able to control it. Ding Ning shook his head and said, Chu will not give unconditionally. The money to provide these things will come from Qin. The old woman was stunned and instinctively said, Bazin Kindo ground? Ding Ning glanced at her and said, not just Bazin Kindo ground. The old woman was not an ordinary person to be able to control the power of Wuji so firmly in her hands. She took a deep breath and completely understood. She said, the old nobility. Ding Ning did not speak. The lack of denial meant tacit agreement. In the past, the old nobility of Chongling had been the true rulers of power and possessed astounding wealth. Now, all the old nobility of Chongling had declined. Even that expert who the world called Yi Xiao was just a person who could not see the light of day. It was just that when those huge old nobles and clans were wiped out, the whereabouts of most of their wealth was still a mystery. Of all the old nobility, the two families with the greatest wealth were the Liu family and the Gongsun family. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.